When I said I do, I deliberately kept my $58 million inheritance a secret from my new husband. My father, a four-star general, had always warned me that wealth attracts parasites wearing friendly faces. I thought he was just being overly cautious, perhaps a bit too rigid from his years in the military. I was wrong. Thank God I kept my mouth shut because exactly 3 days after our wedding, my mother-in-law kicked my front door open with a corporate lawyer in tow, demanding I sign my rights away. I am Camille, 35 years old, and I work as a rare document archivist in Washington, D.C. Before I tell you how I turned their greedy ambush into the biggest mistake of their lives, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart people who thought you were nothing. The morning it happened, the Maryland suburbs were draped in a deceptive golden sunlight. It was a Tuesday, exactly 3 days after Julian and I had stood before 200 guests and promised to love, honor, and protect each other. We had delayed our honeymoon to the Amalfi Coast by a week because Julian had an important product launch at his tech company, so I had taken the week off to settle into our new home and organize the mountain of wedding gifts. I was sitting on the floor of our spacious kitchen, wearing comfortable sweatpants and one of Julian's old college t-shirts, carefully unwrapping a set of crystal wine glasses. The house was quiet save for the muffled sound of Julian's voice drifting down from his upstairs home office, where he was leading a conference call. I felt a profound sense of peace, a quiet joy, that I had finally found my partner in life. That peace shattered with the sharp, aggressive click of the front door unlocking. I had given Valerie, my new mother-in-law, a spare key for emergencies just the day before. It was a gesture of goodwill, an attempt to bridge the gap between us. Valerie was a fixture in Washington, D.C. high society, a woman in her late 60s who obsessed over pedigree designer labels and controlling every aspect of her children's lives. She had never explicitly approved of me. To Valerie, my career as an archivist, preserving rare historical manuscripts, was nothing more than a cute little hobby, entirely unworthy of the circles she moved in. But I had hoped that after the wedding she would finally accept me as her daughter-in-law. The heavy oak door swung open with such force that it bounced against the wall stopper. Valerie marched into the foyer, her expensive high heels clicking like a metronome ticking down to my execution. She was wearing a tailored Chanel suit that probably cost more than my car, her hair impeccably styled, her posture rigid with an arrogant entitlement. But it was not just Valerie who entered my home. Flanking her was a tall, sharp-featured man in a dark, custom-tailored suit, carrying a sleek leather briefcase. He had the cold, calculating eyes of a predator. I stood up from the floor, brushing packing peanuts off my sweatpants, feeling immediately vulnerable and confused. "Valerie, what is going on? Is everything all right?" She did not offer a greeting. She did not ask how I was doing. She marched straight into the kitchen, her eyes sweeping over the boxes and wrapping paper with naked disgust. "We do not have time for pleasantries, Camille," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. She gestured to the man beside her. "This is Mr. Sterling. He is the lead asset protection attorney for our family's estate." Mr. Sterling did not offer his hand. He simply placed his briefcase on my pristine kitchen island, snapped the latches open, and withdrew a thick, professionally bound document. He dropped it onto the marble countertop with a heavy thud. It looked to be at least 40 pages long. "What is this?" I asked, my voice wavering slightly as I looked from the document to the cold, hard expression on my mother-in-law's face. "It is a post-nuptial agreement," Valerie stated as casually as if she were ordering a coffee. "You are going to sign it today." I stared at her, my mind struggling to process the words. "A post-nuptial agreement. We have been married for 3 days, Valerie. Julian and I never discussed a prenuptial agreement, let alone this. Why are you bringing a lawyer into my kitchen without my husband even knowing?" Valerie offered a short, humorless laugh. "Oh, do not be naive, Camille. Julian knows all about this. In fact, it was his idea as much as mine. We simply ran out of time before the ceremony to have the paperwork finalized properly." Julian's career in the tech sector is accelerating rapidly. His equity in his company is growing, and our family has a certain standard of wealth to maintain. She took a step closer, looking me up and down with an expression of pure disdain. "Let us be brutally honest here. Your little dusty library job pays what, $60,000 a year, if you are lucky. You spend your days organizing old pieces of paper while Julian is building the future. You are a financial liability, Camille. We need to protect Julian's growing tech wealth from someone who simply does not understand high society finances. We cannot have a gold digger draining his assets if this little experiment of a marriage does not work out. The words felt like a physical blow to the chest. A gold digger, an experiment. This woman who had smiled for the photographer at our wedding, who had toasted to our happiness, was standing in my kitchen calling me a parasite. My heart began to pound a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I looked toward the staircase, desperate for my husband to come down and throw this woman and her lawyer out of our home. "Julian!" I called out, my voice louder now, tinged with panic and rising anger. "Julian, get down here right now!" The sound of his office door opening upstairs echoed in the quiet house. Heavy footsteps descended the wooden staircase. I watched the archway, my entire body tense, waiting for my protector, my partner, the man who had cried when I walked down the aisle. Julian stepped into the kitchen. He was wearing his expensive noise-canceling headphones around his neck, holding his smartphone. I looked into his eyes, expecting to see shock, expecting him to demand an explanation from his mother. Instead, I saw a cowardly, uncomfortable resignation. He would not meet my gaze. He shuffled his feet, looking at the kitchen floor, looking at the marble island, looking anywhere but at the woman he had just married. "Julian," I said, my voice shaking, "your mother just barged into our home with a lawyer. She just handed me a 40-page post-nuptial agreement and called me a gold digger. Tell her to leave." The silence in the kitchen was agonizing. Mr. Sterling stood perfectly still, watching the family dynamic play out, with the detached interest of a scientist observing insects. Valerie stood tall, a smug, victorious smile playing on her lips. She knew exactly the kind of man she had raised. Julian finally looked up, but not at me. He looked at his mother for approval before he spoke. "It is just protocol, babe," he said, his voice quiet, lacking any trace of the confidence he usually projected in his board meetings. "Mom is right. We have to be practical about my equity. The company is poised for a massive valuation next year. My board of directors suggested I protect my shares. It is nothing personal, it is just business." Nothing personal. I felt the floor drop away beneath me. The man I loved, the man I had trusted with my future, was standing behind his mother's designer handbag, treating our marriage like a corporate merger that needed risk management. He had known about this. They had planned this ambush behind my back while I was excitedly planning our honeymoon and picking out centerpieces. The betrayal was so profound, so absolute, that it temporarily robbed me of oxygen. "You agreed to this?" I asked, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "You let her come into our home to humiliate me." "Oh, stop playing the victim, Camille," Valerie snapped, rolling her eyes. "It is entirely transparent. We all know your background. We all know where you come from. Your father was a career military man. He spent his entire life taking orders from the government. He left you nothing but rigid discipline and a modest government pension. You bring absolutely no capital, no pedigree, and no social leverage to this family. You should be grateful Julian even married you. The least you can do is sign the document and prove you are actually here for love, not for a free ride." As Valerie spoke those incredibly ignorant words, a strange crystalline clarity washed over me. The emotional devastation I was feeling suddenly hardened into something cold and metallic. They had absolutely no idea who I was. They had no idea who my father had been. My father, General Thomas, was not just a career military man. He was a tactical genius, a man who had served 4 tours, commanded thousands, and possessed a brilliant razor-sharp mind for strategy and finance. What Valerie and Julian did not know, what I had deliberately kept quiet, because my father had taught me. The value of stealth was that my father had begun investing heavily in commercial real estate and emerging tech markets in the early 90s. He had amassed a heavily diversified, generational asset portfolio. When he passed away 3 years ago, he left me a staggering $58 million. He had placed the entire fortune in an ironclad blind trust, managed by some of the most ruthless and effective wealth managers in the country. I lived a modest life as an archivist, because I loved preserving history, because I loved the quiet dignity of my work, not because I had to. I could have bought Julian's entire tech company with a single phone call and fired him before lunch. Sign the paperwork, Camille, Mr. Sterling said smoothly, sliding a heavy silver pen across the marble island. It is a standard asset separation agreement. Whatever is Julian's remains Julian's. Whatever is yours remains yours. It simply prevents the commingling of wealth. I did not scream. I did not cry. The archivist in me, the woman trained to read the fine print to handle fragile truths and historical deceptions, took over. I stepped forward and picked up the heavy stack of papers. Camille, come on, Julian pleaded softly, taking a step toward me. Just sign it so we can get back to normal. It really does not change anything between us. I ignored him completely. I ignored Valerie's triumphant smirk. I began to read the document. Mr. Sterling sighed, tapping his expensive watch, clearly annoyed that I was not just blindly obeying their demands. But I read it line by line, page by page, forcing them to stand there in the suffocating silence of the kitchen. The document was incredibly aggressive. It stripped me of any right to the home we currently lived in, heavily favored Julian in the event of a divorce, and demanded that I waive any claim to spousal support. It was designed to leave me destitute. But then, on page 27, I found exactly what I was looking for. Mr. Sterling, in his rush to completely isolate Julian's tech money, had drafted a remarkably broad and absolute firewall clause. I read the specific paragraph twice to make sure my eyes were not deceiving me. Any undisclosed premarital assets, including but not limited to trusts, inheritances, real estate, and capital holdings, remain solely the absolute property of the original owner, completely shielded from the spouse, immune to marital commingling in any state jurisdiction. I almost laughed out loud. The sheer delicious irony of their arrogance was staggering. They were so blinded by their own perceived superiority, so absolutely convinced that I was a penniless charity case, that they had just handed me the ultimate legal shield. If I refused to sign this post-nuptial agreement, my $58 million trust would become marital property under our state laws, meaning Julian would be legally entitled to half of it in a divorce. By forcing me to sign this document, they were legally locking Julian out of $29 million. I looked up from the pages. Julian looked stressed, shifting his weight from foot to foot. Valerie looked impatient, tapping her manicured fingernails against her purse. "You are absolutely certain this is what you want, Julian?" I asked, looking directly into his eyes, giving him one final solitary chance to be the man I thought I married. "You want to draw a hard line between your money and my money, forever." Julian swallowed hard, glancing at his mother before looking back at me. "Yes," he said. "It is for the best, Camille. You have to understand." "I understand perfectly," I replied. My voice was steady, void of any emotion. I picked up the silver pen. I did not hesitate. I flipped to the back page and signed my name with a smooth, decisive flourish. I initialed every required page, legally binding myself to the terms. I slid the document back across the island toward the lawyer. Mr. Sterling quickly reviewed the signatures, nodded to Valerie, and snapped the document into his briefcase. "A very sensible decision, Camille," Valerie said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness, now that she had gotten exactly what she wanted. "I am glad to see you can be reasonable. Julian, darling, I will call you later to finalize the yacht arrangements with Preston." Without another word to me, she turned and marched out of the house, the lawyer following close behind. The front door clicked shut, leaving Julian and me alone in the kitchen. He let out a long, pathetic sigh of relief and moved to hug me. "Thank you, babe," he murmured, reaching for my waist. "I know that was intense, but my mom just worries, now we can put this behind us." I took a sharp step backward, avoiding his touch. The physical revulsion I felt toward him was instantaneous and overwhelming. The illusion of my marriage had burned to the ground in less than 20 minutes. "Do not touch me," I said, my voice cold enough to freeze water. Julian looked genuinely shocked, as if he expected me to just bounce back and be his loving, compliant wife. Before he could attempt to gaslight me further, my cell phone buzzed loudly on the counter. It was the family group chat. I picked up the phone. The message was from Preston, my white brother-in-law, who was married to Julian's sister, Chloe. Preston was a pompous, aggressive venture capitalist who loved to act like the smartest man in the room. He relied entirely on Valerie's social connections to fund his business ventures, and he had made it abundantly clear at the wedding that he looked down on me. The text read, Julian Camille. Just a heads up, the catering bill for the upcoming Family Society Gala came in higher than expected. I need you guys to wire $15,000 by tomorrow to cover your share of the event. Do not make Mom pay for your dead weight this time. I stared at the glowing screen. The absolute unmitigated audacity of this family. They had just forced me to sign away my rights to my husband's money, treating me like a worthless beggar. And in the very next breath, they were demanding I help finance their extravagant lifestyle. I looked at Julian, who was reading the same text on his own phone. He looked embarrassed, but he immediately started typing a response, eager to please his wealthy brother-in-law. I set my phone face down on the marble counter. I had cried enough tears for this family. I was done being the quiet, unassuming archivist who took their abuse with a polite smile. Valerie, Julian, and Preston thought they had backed a helpless lamb into a corner. They had no idea they had just unleashed a predator with 58 million reasons to destroy them. The game had just changed, and I was going to ensure that by the time I was finished, they would not have a single dime left to their names. I sat at a custom mahogany dining table in Potomac, Maryland, listening to my brother-in-law call my career a cute little charity project. My husband sat right next to me, silently swirling his scotch, too cowardly to defend the woman he had married just weeks ago. They all thought my silence was submission. They thought I was just a broke archivist sitting in awe of their extravagant lifestyle. They had absolutely no idea that I was quietly calculating exactly how much it would cost to buy their entire lives and sell them for scrap. The invitation to dinner at Chloe and Preston's sprawling estate came only 2 days after the aggressive post-nuptial ambush in my kitchen. Julian had practically begged me to go, insisting we needed to smooth things over with his family. Smooth things over was Julian's code for sweeping their blatant disrespect under the rug. I agreed to attend not for Julian, but because my father had always taught me to study the enemy's territory before launching a strike. Preston and Chloe lived in a massive, newly built mansion that screamed new money and severe insecurity, from the oversized crystal chandeliers visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows, to the imported sports cars parked strategically in the circular driveway. Everything about their home was designed to intimidate. It was a sterile, soulless fortress of modern glass and gray stone, completely devoid of any real warmth. When Julian and I walked through the double iron doors, we were immediately hit with the overwhelming scent of expensive catering and Chloe's heavy designer perfume. Chloe, Julian's younger sister, greeted us with a smile that did not even attempt to reach her eyes. She was draped in recognizable designer labels from head to toe, looking more like a walking billboard than a gracious host. Before I could even hand my coat to the hired staff, Chloe was already looking me up and down with barely concealed pity. She reached out and pinched the fabric of the sleeve on my dress. It was a simple, elegant navy sheath dress I had bought off the rack at a mid-tier department store. I loved it because it was practical and well-made, but to Chloe, it was an unforgivable offense against their social standing. "Oh, Camille," Chloe said, letting out a dramatic, breathy sigh. "You wore that. It is very vintage. Or is it just old? I could have lent you something from my closet. We are having a few of Preston's investors over for drinks later, and we really need everyone to look the part. You understand, right? We have a certain image to maintain in this neighborhood." I felt Julian stiffen beside me, but he said absolutely nothing. He just offered his sister a weak, apologetic smile, as if agreeing that my appearance was a genuine liability to the family name. I looked at Chloe's hands, noticing the flashy diamond rings that looked suspiciously like they had been purchased on credit to impress Valerie's judgmental social circle. "I am perfectly comfortable in what I am wearing." "Chloe," I said evenly, keeping my posture perfectly straight. "But thank you for your concern about the investors. I am sure they will be much more focused on Preston's financial portfolio than the brand of my dress." Chloe's eyes narrowed, instantly sensing the subtle challenge in my tone. Before she could formulate a sharp response, Preston's booming voice echoed from the formal dining room, demanding our presence. Preston was a tall, loud venture capitalist who genuinely believed he was the smartest man in Washington, D.C. He had married into Julian's family, eagerly attaching himself to Valerie's extensive elite connections to fund his endless string of startups. As we took our seats at the excessively decorated table, Preston immediately took control of the room. He did not ask how our wedding went. He did not ask how we were settling into our new home. He went straight into a relentless monologue about his own brilliance. As the catering staff poured expensive wine, Preston talked loudly about his high society connections, casually dropping names of senators and tech billionaires he claimed to play golf with on weekends. He boasted about a new tech incubator he was launching, puffing his chest out, while Julian leaned forward, hanging on to every word, like a desperate intern looking for a promotion. Then Preston set his sights on me. He took a long sip of his vintage red wine and pointed his silver fork directly across the table at my face. "So, Camille," Preston said, his tone dripping with heavy condescension, "Julian tells me you are still playing librarian. What is it you actually do again? Dust off old pieces of paper for the Historical Society. How exactly does that pay the bills?" "I am a rare document archivist," I corrected calmly, picking up my knife and fork, refusing to let him see any irritation. "I authenticate and preserve historical manuscripts. It requires specialized knowledge of preservation chemistry and deep historical context." Preston chuckled loudly, looking at Julian as if they were sharing a hilarious inside joke. "Right, right. That is a nice, cute charity project you have got going there. Good for the soul, I suppose. But in the real world, in the world of high-stakes capital where Julian and I operate, we deal with things that actually move the needle. You know, real wealth generation. You cannot build a family legacy on library wages, Camille. It is a good thing you married Julian. I is going to need to carry the heavy financial weight for both of you." I turned my head to look at my husband. This was the moment. This was the exact moment any decent man would step in, set a firm boundary, and demand respect for the woman he chose to marry. I waited for Julian to remind Preston that my career was prestigious, that I held a master's degree, and that my work mattered. Instead, Julian took a nervous gulp of his scotch. He shrank down in his expensive dining chair, completely emasculated, and offered Preston a submissive nod. "She likes the quiet work," Julian muttered, completely invalidating my entire existence to appease his arrogant brother-in-law. "We will figure out the finances. I have got my stock options vesting soon, and I am expecting a promotion by the fourth quarter." Speaking of finances, Preston pivoted smoothly, leaning forward and resting his elbows on the table. "Julian, I assume you saw my text about the upcoming society gala. The catering bill came in much higher than expected because Chloe wanted the premium seafood package. I need 15 grand wired to my account by Monday morning. We cannot have Valerie covering your wife's portion again. You need to pull your weight in this family." I stared at Preston in disbelief. They were actively extorting my husband to fund their lavish lifestyle, masking it as a family obligation. I knew for a fact that Julian and I did not have $15,000 in liquid cash sitting around in our joint checking account. We had just paid for our wedding and closed on our house. "I will get it to you, man," Julian said quickly, his voice tight with anxiety. "I will move some things around from our savings. Do not worry about it." "Julian, we cannot afford to drain our emergency savings for a party," I said, keeping my voice low and reasonable. "We just bought a house." Chloe slammed her wine glass down. "Oh, please, Camille. Do not start crying poor at my dinner table. If you cannot afford the lifestyle, maybe you should not have married into a family that operates at this level. Julian knows what is expected of him." The betrayal stung deeper than I could have imagined, but the pain was rapidly replaced by a profound, icy clarity. I looked around that lavish dining room. I looked at Chloe's desperate designer armor, at Preston's dangerously inflated ego, and at my husband's pathetic, embarrassing cowardice. They were all performing. They were drowning in the desperate need to appear wealthy and powerful, completely oblivious to the fact that true wealth never needs to scream its presence. My father's $58 million sat quietly in a secure blind trust, generating more interest in a single day than Preston's flashy venture capital firm probably made in a month. They wanted to treat me like a peasant. They wanted to make me the punchline of their high society jokes and use me as a scapegoat for their own financial insecurities. I took a slow, deliberate bite of my dinner. I decided right then and there to let them dig their own graves. I would let them talk. I would let them boast. I would let them show me exactly who they were without interruption. Because when the time came to pull the rug out from under them and take everything they held dear, I did not want to feel a single ounce of mercy. The catering staff moved silently around the mahogany table, clearing our dinner plates and replacing them with a ridiculously ostentatious dessert. It was a dark chocolate dome dusted with edible gold leaf, resting on a bed of spun sugar. The sheer excess of it perfectly matched the suffocating atmosphere of Chloe and Preston's home. As I picked up my dessert spoon, Preston leaned back in his custom-upholstered chair, unbuttoning his suit jacket with the bloated satisfaction of a man who loved the sound of his own voice. He clinked his spoon against his crystal water glass to command the table's attention, as if anyone in this family dared to look away when he was speaking. "Listen up, everyone!" Preston announced, a wide, predatory grin spreading across his flushed face. "Summer is right around the corner, and I have just secured a premier slip down in Annapolis. I have been negotiating with a broker in Miami, and by next month we are going to be the proud co-owners of a 70-foot Sunseeker yacht." Chloe clapped her hands together, the massive diamonds on her fingers catching the light from the chandelier. She beamed at her husband, playing the role of the adoring, wealthy socialite to absolute perfection. Valerie smiled approvingly, taking a slow sip of her wine. "It is going to be spectacular for hosting our summer galas," Valerie chimed in, already mentally drafting the guest list of politicians and social climbers she planned to impress. Preston nodded, pointing a finger at Julian. "I am setting it up as a family asset, Julian, a joint venture. I am putting you down for a $25,000 buy-in. That covers your share of the initial lease, the crew retainer, and the slip fees for the season. We will split the maintenance costs at the end of the summer." Julian actually choked on his scotch. He quickly grabbed his napkin, coughing into it while his eyes darted around the table. $25,000. For Julian and me, a newly married couple who had just poured a massive down payment into our Maryland home and funded our own wedding that was an absurd demand for liquid cash. Julian was a mid-level tech executive. He made good money, but he was nowhere near the tax bracket required to casually drop 25 grand on a shared boat just to appease his brother-in-law's ego. Julian cleared his throat, his face turning a shade of panicked gray. "Wow, Preston. A Sunseeker. That is incredible, man, but 25,000 right now is a little steep. We just closed on the house." Preston's smile vanished instantly. The jovial, welcoming brother-in-law act dropped, revealing the entitled, aggressive venture capitalist beneath. He looked at Julian not as family, but as a subordinate who was failing to meet a quota. Steve Preston scoffed loudly, exchanging a knowing look with Chloe. "Julian, it is an investment in our lifestyle. It is networking. Do you know how many tech investors I can get on that boat? You have to spend money to make money. I am giving you a prime opportunity to sit at the adults' table. Do not tell me you are suddenly strapped for cash." I watched my husband shrink in his seat. The desperation rolling off Julian was palpable. He craved Preston's validation. He desperately wanted to be seen as an equal to this white venture capitalist who had married into his family and somehow managed to position himself at the top of their social hierarchy. I decided to intervene, hoping to give my husband an easy out. "Preston, it sounds like a beautiful vessel," I said, keeping my voice perfectly measured and polite. "But Julian is right. We just finalized the mortgage and the wedding expenses. Dropping $25,000 on a luxury lease is simply not a practical financial decision for us this quarter." The entire dining room went dead silent. The catering staff seemed to freeze against the walls. Chloe let out a sharp, mocking laugh, covering her mouth with her manicured hand. Valerie set her wine glass down with a sharp clink. She looked at me as if I were a cockroach that had just crawled out of her designer salad. "Camille, darling," Valerie began, her tone dripping with toxic, weaponized pity. "This is exactly what I warned Julian about. You simply lack the vision for how families like ours operate. You think like someone who lives paycheck to paycheck. You have that rigid military government handout mentality from your father." I felt a hot spike of rage behind my eyes at the mention of my father, but I forced my facial muscles to remain completely relaxed. "You spend your days hiding in a basement with old paper?" Valerie continued, gesturing dismissively at me. "You do not understand networking. You do not understand generational wealth building. A yacht is not a toy, it is a boardroom on the water. But of course you would not comprehend that on a librarian's salary." You cannot even afford the designer clothes required to attend our events, let alone contribute to a family asset. She turned her sharp gaze to Julian. Julian, I am deeply embarrassed. You are a tech executive. Are you really going to let your wife's financial inferiority hold you back from participating in this family's legacy? Are you going to be the only one sitting on the shore while Preston introduces us to his elite circles? The manipulation was masterful. Valerie knew exactly which of Julian's buttons to push. She attacked his pride, his status, and his deep-seated fear of missing out. I looked at my husband, waiting for him to defend our household. I waited for him to tell his mother not to disrespect my career. I waited for him to tell Preston that our financial boundaries were not up for debate. Instead, Julian straightened his posture, his eyes avoiding mine entirely. He looked at Preston with a pathetic, desperate eagerness. "Do not worry about it, Preston," Julian said, his voice loud and overly confident. "I will wire you the 25 grand by Monday morning. I will just liquidate some of my vested stock early. We are in." "Julian," I said sharply, dropping all pretense of polite dinner conversation. "You cannot liquidate your stock for a boat lease. We discussed our financial timeline just last week." Julian finally turned to look at me, and the expression on his face made my blood run ice cold. There was no love in his eyes. There was only resentment. He was looking at me exactly the way Valerie looked at me, like I was a burden, like I was a peasant dragging down his royal ascent. "I make the real money in our house, Camille." Julian snapped, his voice echoing in the large dining room. "I am the one building a tech empire. I know you cannot contribute to something like this on your meager salary, but I will not let you embarrass me in front of my family. I will carry your dead weight on this. You just get to sit back and enjoy the ride." Dead weight. The words hung in the air, heavy and violent. Chloe smiled with vicious satisfaction, taking a slow bite of her chocolate dessert. Preston smirked, raising his glass to Julian in a silent toast of masculine solidarity. Valerie looked absolutely triumphant, having successfully fractured my marriage and established her absolute dominance in a matter of minutes. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting neatly in my lap. I did not flush with embarrassment. I did not rise to the bait and cause a screaming match. I simply absorbed the brutal reality of the man I had married. Julian was not a partner. He was a parasite desperate for a host. He was perfectly willing to financially ruin our new household just to buy a temporary ticket into Preston's fraudulent inner circle. He had humiliated me, discarded my input, and publicly branded me as dead weight to appease his mother's vanity. What none of them knew as they sat there glowing with their petty victory was that I was doing the math in my head. I was calculating exactly how long it took for my father's blind trust to generate $25,000. Based on the aggressive yield of my commercial real estate portfolio and the dividends from my tech sector holdings, my trust earned $25,000 in roughly 6 hours. I made their entire summer yacht budget while I was sleeping. They thought they were untouchable. They thought they had successfully put the poor, uncultured archivist in her place. But as I looked at Julian's pathetic, desperate smile and Valerie's arrogant posture, a terrifying sense of calm washed over me. I had signed that post-nuptial agreement to protect myself, but now I realized it was the weapon I would use to destroy them. I swallowed the humiliation with a sip of water, smiling politely at the table, knowing with absolute certainty that I was going to watch this entire family burn to the ground. 3 days after that suffocating dinner in Potomac, the illusion of our partnership took its final and fatal hit. I was sitting at the kitchen island, the exact spot where Valerie had slammed down her ridiculous post-nuptial agreement just a week prior. It was a Thursday evening, and I had my laptop open to go through our monthly expenses. I logged into our joint checking account to pay the water bill and the upcoming property tax installment. I expected to see the comfortable cushion we had built together. We had deposited all of our monetary wedding gifts into that account. I had transferred a significant portion of my visible savings into it, and Julian had just deposited his monthly executive salary. It was supposed to be the foundation of our new shared life. Instead, the screen displayed a balance of $34.12. I blinked, assuming there was a glitch with the banking portal. I refreshed the page. The numbers stayed exactly the same. My heart did a slow, painful roll in my chest as I clicked on the transaction history. There it was, sitting at the very top of the ledger. A direct wire transfer for $40,000. The recipient name made my blood run absolutely cold. It read Preston Vanguard Capital. Julian had not just paid the $25,000 for a fraction of a yacht to appease his arrogant brother-in-law. He had given Preston an additional $15,000 on top of it. He had completely drained the account that held our mortgage payment, our grocery money, and our emergency funds. He had handed over every liquid cent we shared as a married couple so he could pretend to be a high roller in Preston's inner circle. And he had done it without saying a single word to me. I closed the laptop very slowly. I did not panic. I did not cry. I simply sat there in the quiet of our kitchen and waited. Julian walked through the front door an hour later. He was whistling a cheerful tune, carrying his expensive leather briefcase, looking like a man without a single care in the world. He tossed his keys onto the console table and walked into the kitchen, stopping when he saw me sitting perfectly still at the island in the dim evening light. "Hey, babe," he said, loosening his silk tie with a relaxed sigh. "How was the archives today? Did you find any exciting old maps?" "Where is our money, Julian?" I asked. My voice was perfectly flat and devoid of any emotion. He froze. The casual, confident posture vanished instantly, replaced by a defensive, rigid stiffness. He refused to look me in the eye. "What are you talking about?" "I logged in to pay the utilities and the property tax," I said, keeping my gaze locked on his face. "The joint account is empty. There was a wire transfer this morning for $40,000 to Preston's venture capital firm. You drained our account." Julian let out an exasperated sigh, running a hand over his face like I was the one being completely unreasonable. He walked over to the refrigerator, grabbed a bottle of cold water, and took a long, slow drink before turning back to face me. "Camille, I told you at the dinner party that I was going to handle the yacht investment," he said, using a tone you would use to placate a confused child. "Preston gave me a prime opportunity to buy into one of his new tech incubators on top of the boat lease. It is an exclusive friends and family buy-in. It is a guaranteed return. I am making moves for our future." "With our mortgage money?" I asked, my voice rising just a fraction to meet his arrogance. "Julian, you took $40,000. You took the wedding gifts. You took my savings. You left us with $34 to our name. How exactly are we supposed to pay our bills this month?" Julian slammed his water bottle down on the marble counter. The sudden violence of the gesture made me flinch backward. He glared at me, the mask of the loving, supportive husband completely slipping away to reveal the entitled, arrogant boy his mother had raised. "We are not struggling, Camille." He snapped, his voice echoing sharply in the kitchen. "I will get my quarterly bonus next month. Until then, put the groceries on a credit card like a normal person. You are completely overreacting over a temporary cash flow shift." "I am reacting to the fact that my husband stole our living expenses to impress his white brother-in-law," I said, refusing to back down from his glare. "You stole from me, Julian." That was the trigger. Julian stepped closer to the island, pointing his finger directly at my face. "Do not ever talk about my business decisions like that again, and let us get one thing absolutely straight right now. You do not get to dictate how I invest my money." "It is a joint account," I reminded him, gripping the edge of the counter. "My paychecks go into that account too. My savings went into that account." Julian let out a harsh, mocking laugh that sounded exactly like the cruel sounds Valerie and Chloe made. "Oh, please, do not embarrass yourself, Camille. Your little library paychecks barely cover the utility bills. I am the one bringing in the real wealth. I am the tech executive. I am the one operating at a high level. You just catalog old paper all day. You do not earn nearly enough to have a seat at the table when it comes to my financial portfolio." I stared at him, letting his vicious words hang in the silent kitchen. "In fact," Julian continued, his voice dripping with cruel condescension, "you should be grateful. You should be down on your knees thanking God that I let you live in my house. Because without me, you would still be living in some cramped apartment making archivist wages. I provide this beautiful lifestyle for you. I put a roof over your head, so do not ever question my financial authority again." My house. He actually said my house. We had shopped for this beautiful Maryland home together. We had picked out the paint colors together. We had stood in the empty living room before we moved in and promised to fill it with love and respect. But in his mind, because he perceived himself as the primary breadwinner, I was nothing more than a charity case he was graciously allowing to sleep in his bed. He truly believed I was a financial parasite, just like his mother had claimed the day she shoved that post-nuptial agreement in my face. I looked at the man standing in front of me, the man I had promised to love in sickness and in health. He was puffed up with unearned pride, desperately trying to feel like a titan of industry by bullying his own wife. He felt so powerful standing there, belittling my passion for history, diminishing my career and erasing my contributions to our marriage. If he only knew the truth. If he only knew that the $58 million sitting safely in my blind trust could have bought his entire neighborhood with cash to spare. If he only knew that my so-called library paychecks were just something I did for deep personal fulfillment, while my investment dividends accrued more wealth in a single week than his entire tech career would generate in a decade. He had drained our joint account to buy his way into a fake elite circle. He had chosen to be a lackey for Preston rather than a partner to me. I did not yell. I did not throw his cruel words back in his face. The archivist in me simply took the information, cataloged his betrayal, and filed it away as absolute proof that my marriage was a sham. I stood up from the bar stool, picked up my laptop, and looked at him with an expression of complete and utter emptiness. "I understand perfectly, Julian," I said softly, my voice devoid of any warmth. "I will never question your financial authority again." He smirked, clearly satisfied that he had successfully put me in my place. He rolled his shoulders back, victorious. "Good," he muttered, turning his back to me to open the refrigerator. "I am glad we are finally on the same page. Now I have a video call with Preston in 10 minutes. I need the house quiet." I walked away, heading up the stairs to the guest bedroom. I needed space to think. Julian had just shown me exactly who he was, and more importantly, he had shown me exactly how to destroy him. He was obsessed with status. He was obsessed with Preston's approval. He was desperate to be seen as a wealthy power player, and he had drained his own safety net to buy a fleeting illusion of grandeur. They wanted to play high-stakes financial games. They wanted to use money as a weapon to isolate and humiliate me. I sat on the edge of the guest bed and pulled my cell phone from my pocket. I scrolled past Julian's contact, past Valerie's number, and dialed the private unlisted line for my lead asset manager in Washington. It was time to stop playing the quiet, supportive wife. It was time to start making my own investments. 2 weeks passed since Julian emptied our joint bank account. I played the part of the quiet, submissive wife to absolute perfection. I smiled over our morning coffee. I ironed his expensive dress shirts. I watched him strut around our home, completely convinced he had broken my spirit and put me in my proper place. Behind the scenes, my asset managers were moving tens of millions of dollars through corporate shell companies, laying the invisible groundwork for a financial massacre. But before the trap could snap shut, I had to endure one final, incredibly public humiliation. Valerie was hosting the highlight of her social calendar, the annual Potomac Heritage Charity Gala. It was a massive, ostentatious event held in the grand ballroom of a historic downtown Washington hotel. The guest list was a who is who of political operatives, tech billionaires, and old money socialites. This was Valerie's arena. This was the exact place where she proved her worth to the world, parading her family around like prized show ponies for everyone to envy. Julian was a nervous wreck the entire car ride into the city. He kept adjusting his bow tie and checking his reflection in his smartphone screen, muttering about how important it was to secure FaceTime with Preston's high-net-worth investors. He did not say a single word about how I looked. I had chosen a deep emerald evening gown, understated but tailored to perfection. I knew I looked beautiful, but to Julian, I was just a mandatory accessory he was forced to drag along to maintain the image of a stable family man. When we stepped into the grand ballroom, the sheer scale of Valerie's vanity was on full display. Massive floral arrangements of white orchids towered over tables draped in heavy gold silk. A live orchestra played classical music from a raised velvet-draped stage. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos circulated endlessly with silver trays of premium champagne and caviar. Julian immediately spotted Preston and Chloe near the absolute center of the room. Their VIP table was positioned directly in front of the main stage, surrounded by senators and wealthy venture capitalists. Chloe was wearing a diamond necklace that practically blinded anyone who looked in her direction, laughing loudly at something Preston was saying. Julian grabbed my elbow and pulled me toward them, eager to kiss the ring and claim his spot among the elite. We reached the center table. Julian found his name engraved on a heavy cardstock place card right next to Preston. He pulled out his chair, a wide, desperate smile plastered on his face. I walked to the seat next to him, expecting to see my name. The place card reads Senator Davies. I checked the seat on the other side of Julian. It belonged to the chief executive officer of a major defense contracting firm. I walked around the entire massive circular table. My name was nowhere to be found. Julian noticed me hovering. He frowned, looking annoyed rather than concerned that his wife did not have a seat. Before he could ask what I was doing, the sharp, unmistakable scent of Valerie's signature heavy floral perfume hit me from behind. I turned around to find my mother-in-law standing there. She was wearing a custom silver sequined gown, holding a crystal flute of champagne, and looking at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated malice. "You are blocking the walkway, Camille," Valerie said. Her voice carried easily over the ambient noise of the ballroom, deliberately loud. Several people at the neighboring VIP tables paused their networking to turn and look at us. I kept my voice perfectly level. "Valerie, it seems there was a mistake with the seating arrangement. I cannot find my place card at my husband's table." Valerie let out a high melodic laugh that was engineered to attract even more attention. The socialites nearby stopped their conversations completely, their eyes darting between me and the host of the gala. "There is no mistake, darling," Valerie said. She stepped closer to me so her voice projected clearly to Preston, Chloe, and the listening investors. "You are not seated at the center table. This table is reserved for our premium donors and individuals with a certain pedigree. People who actually move capital in this city. You understand, do you not? We simply did not have room for library staff up front." I felt the blood rush to my ears. She was doing this deliberately. She had orchestrated this exact moment to put me in my place, in front of the most powerful people in Washington. She wanted everyone to know that Julian had married beneath him, and she wanted to punish me for simply existing in her space. "Where am I seated, Valerie?" I asked, refusing to break eye contact or show a single ounce of intimidation. She gestured vaguely toward the very back of the massive ballroom. I turned to look. Way in the back, tucked into a dark, cramped corner, directly next to the swinging metal doors of the catering kitchen, was a small, undecorated table. It did not have the gold silk tablecloth. It did not have the towering floral centerpieces. It was currently occupied by 2 off-duty security guards and a few members of the hotel's administrative staff who were eating dinner on their break. "Table 42, Valerie said, her smile widening into a triumphant, vicious smirk. "It is right by the kitchen. You should feel right at home back there. Do not worry, they serve the exact same chicken as the VIP tables. Now please run along. You are embarrassing Julian by standing here looking lost." I turned to look at my husband. The man who had stood at an altar just weeks ago and vowed to protect me. The man who had drained our joint bank account to buy his way to this very table. Julian was looking down at his lap. He was smoothing his linen napkin over his legs, pretending he could not hear his mother publicly degrading his wife. He was a coward, paralyzed by his desperate need for his mother's approval and Preston's validation. "Julian," I said, my voice steady, but loud enough for the entire table to hear. "Are you going to sit at table 42 with your wife, or are you going to sit here?" Preston let out a loud, barking laugh, shaking his head, as if I had just told a hilarious joke. Chloe leaned over and whispered something to a senator's wife, causing both women to giggle behind their champagne glasses, their eyes locked on my humiliation. Julian finally looked up. His eyes were full of resentment. He was furious at me for forcing him to make a choice in front of his precious investors. He adjusted his bow tie, his face flushed with embarrassment. "Babe, just go sit where my mom put you," Julian muttered, his tone dripping with irritation and condescension. "This is a crucial networking night for me and Preston. I need to be at this table. Do not make a scene and ruin this for my career. Just go sit down. We will talk about it in the car later." He dismissed me. He completely and utterly discarded me to sit next to a white venture capitalist who treated him like a subordinate pet. Julian chose a chair over his own marriage. Valerie placed a manicured hand on my shoulder, giving me a hard, patronizing pat. "You heard your husband, Camille. Run along. The adults have business to discuss." I did not cause a scene. I did not throw my drink in her face. I did not yell at Julian or beg him to defend me. I simply looked at the three of them. I memorized the smug arrogance on Valerie's face. I memorized the cruel delight in Chloe's eyes. I memorized the absolute pathetic weakness of my husband. I turned around and walked the entire length of the ballroom. I felt the pitying stares of the wealthy guests burning into my back. I walked past the gold-draped tables, past the politicians and the executives, all the way to the dark, forgotten corner by the swinging kitchen doors. I pulled out a flimsy folding chair at table 42. One of the security guards gave me a sympathetic knowing nod as I sat down. The smell of dish soap and industrial cooking oil wafted through the doors every time a waiter pushed past with a tray of dirty plates. The noise of clattering silverware and shouting chefs completely drowned out the soft orchestra music from the front of the room. I sat there in the shadows looking across the vast expanse of the ballroom, watching my husband laugh and drink at the center table. He was trying so desperately to look like a titan of industry. He was trying so hard to belong to a world he could not actually afford, sacrificing his dignity and his wife for a seat at the table. I slowly opened my small evening clutch. I pulled out my cell phone. The screen illuminated my face in the dim light of the kitchen corner. I opened my contacts and found the private number for my lead trust manager at the wealth management firm. They thought they had broken me. They thought seating me next to the trash receptacles would teach me my place in their social hierarchy. They believed I was just a broke, helpless archivist who had no choice but to swallow their abuse because I relied on Julian for a roof over my head. They had no idea that I held the power to buy the entire hotel we were sitting in. They had no idea that my four-star general father had taught me how to launch a devastating strike only when the enemy is completely blinded by their own arrogance. I sat in the dark, breathing in the scent of bleach and roasted chicken, and pressed the call button. It was time to show Valerie exactly what real power looked like. The morning after the charity gala felt entirely different from any other morning of my brief marriage. The Maryland suburbs were quiet, but the air inside our home was thick with the lingering scent of stale bourbon and absolute desperation. Julian had come home the previous night in a state of blind, destructive rage. My anonymous phone call from the catering kitchen had worked flawlessly. The event organizers, terrified of losing their largest financial backer, had unceremoniously evicted Valerie Preston Chloe and my spineless husband from the center VIP table to accommodate my invisible trust. They had been forced to sit at the very back of the ballroom, completely stripped of the high society status they worshipped. Julian had blamed me for the humiliation, screaming that my bad energy had cursed the evening. He had paced our hardwood floors completely intoxicated, shouting that the family was under too much pressure. In his arrogant, unhinged rant, he had crossed a line he could never uncross. He had screamed that Preston desperately needed capital and that he had already leveraged our house to keep the family afloat. Those words had echoed in my mind all night. Leveraged our house. Now, with Julian gone to his tech office for the day, the house was perfectly still. I walked up my bare feet silent on the plush carpet. I did not feel the crushing, paralyzing grief of a betrayed wife. I felt the cold, methodical focus of an archivist. My father had taught me that when the enemy makes a mistake driven by emotion, you do not react. You gather intelligence. I pushed open the door to Julian's home office. It was decorated exactly like the man himself, full of expensive, superficial tech gadgets and framed motivational quotes that meant absolutely nothing. I went straight for the heavy steel filing cabinet tucked beneath his standing desk. It was locked, but Julian was a creature of lazy habits. I found the spare key taped underneath his desk lamp within 30 seconds. I pulled open the bottom drawer, sliding my fingers past folders of utility bills and car insurance policies, until I found a thick, unmarked manila envelope hidden at the very back. The paper was heavy, the kind used for official legal contracts. I pulled it out and carried it to his desk, laying it flat under the bright LED desk lamp. It was a loan agreement from a highly aggressive predatory lending firm based out of Delaware. I scanned the first page, my eyes darting over the dense legal jargon. It was a second mortgage on our newly purchased Maryland home. The loan amount was staggering, $750,000. My breath hitched slightly in my throat. I turned to the final page, the signature block. There, printed clearly under the borrower section, was Julian's signature. Right next to it on the line designated for the co-borrower was my name, Camille. I leaned in closer, studying the blue ink. As a rare document archivist, I spent my entire professional life analyzing handwriting, identifying the subtle pressures of a pen stroke and spotting historical forgeries. The signature on this page was an absolute amateurish fake. The loop on the capital letter was too wide. The slant of the vowels lacked my usual sharp right-handed inclination. Julian had not even tried to hire a professional. He had simply sat at his desk, practiced my name a few times on scrap paper, and forged my signature to a federal financial document. I had stolen the equity of the home we were supposed to build a family in, all to hand $750,000 over to Preston. It was not just a profound marital betrayal. It was bank fraud. It was wire fraud. It was a federal felony that carried a mandatory prison sentence. I did not scream. I did not tear the paper. I calmly placed the documents back into the manila envelope, slid the envelope into my leather tote bag, and locked the filing cabinet. I walked downstairs, grabbed my car keys, and drove straight out of the Maryland suburbs toward downtown Washington, D.C. I parked my car in the secure underground garage of a towering glass and steel building on K Street. This was the fortress where my father's $58 million legacy was managed. I took the private elevator up to the top floor, stepping out into a silent, sprawling reception area lined with dark mahogany wood and original abstract artwork. This was what real wealth looked like. It did not scream for attention at charity galas. It operated in total silence. I was immediately ushered into the corner boardroom overlooking the Capitol building. Waiting for me were two men who guarded my life. Attorney Caldwell, the ruthless lead litigator for my trust, and Jonathan, my primary wealth manager. They both stood respectfully as I entered, immediately sensing the shift in my demeanor. I was no longer the unassuming daughter of the general seeking passive growth. I was a woman preparing for war. I pulled the manila envelope from my tote bag and slid it across the polished boardroom table. I need a complete analysis of this document, I said, taking my seat at the head of the table. And I need a full, unrestricted forensic financial background check on Preston Vanguard Capital and my husband's tech equity. Attorney Caldwell put on his reading glasses and opened the envelope. The room was silent for 5 agonizing minutes as he reviewed the loan agreement. When he finally looked up, his expression was grim and intensely serious. "Camille," he said, his voice lowering to a professional register. "This is a forged signature on a secondary mortgage application. Your husband has committed multiple federal offenses here. We can file an injunction immediately. We can have him arrested before dinner." "No," I replied instantly, my voice completely devoid of hesitation. "Putting him in jail is too easy. If I send him to prison now, he gets to play the victim. His mother gets to spin a narrative where the evil wife destroyed her son. I do not want to put them in jail. I want to leave them with absolutely nothing." "Jonathan, what did you find on Preston's venture capital firm?" Jonathan opened a sleek silver laptop, pulling up a series of encrypted financial dossiers his team had compiled at my request earlier that morning. He projected the data onto the large screen at the end of the boardroom. "The picture is incredibly ugly." Camille, Jonathan began, pointing a laser pointer at a graph plummeting downward into red territory. "Preston Vanguard Capital is a complete house of cards. His entire business model relies on leveraging Valerie's high society connections to secure initial seed money, which he then burns through on lifestyle expenses and terrible tech investments. He has not produced a positive return for his investors in 3 years." Jonathan clicked to the next slide, showing a complex web of corporate debt. "Right now, Preston is drowning. He is facing massive margin calls from aggressive private lenders. His firm is hemorrhaging money so fast that they are legally bordering on insolvency. If he does not secure a corporate buyout within the next 30 days, he will face federal bankruptcy and likely an investigation by the Securities and Exchange Commission for defrauding his investors." I stared at the screen, piecing the puzzle together. That is why Valerie was so desperate to seat Preston at the center table last night. The charity gala was not just a social flex. It was a desperate, panicked performance. They were trying to look incredibly wealthy and successful to lure in a bailout investor before their entire fake empire collapsed. And Julian, I asked, keeping my gaze locked on the financial ruin displayed on the screen. How deep is my husband in this mess? Jonathan sighed, bringing up a new financial chart. Julian is the definition of collateral damage. He is so desperate for Preston's approval that he has completely compromised his own future. Beyond draining your joint checking account, Julian has pledged all of his unvested tech stock as collateral to help Preston secure short-term loans. He essentially handed his entire professional future over to a sinking ship. If Preston's firm goes under, Julian's equity is wiped out completely to satisfy the creditors. He will be utterly destitute. The sheer magnitude of their stupidity was staggering. They had treated me like a financial liability. They had forced me to sign a post-nuptial agreement to protect their imaginary wealth from my supposed greed. All while they were secretly drowning in millions of dollars of toxic debt, surviving purely on forged documents and arrogant delusion. They thought I was a peasant dragging down their elite ascent. In reality, I was the only person in their orbit who actually held genuine unencumbered capital. Camille Attorney Caldwell said, folding his hands on the table. We can extract you from this marriage clean. With the post-nuptial agreement, Valerie forced you to sign your trust is completely shielded. We prove the forgery on the house, dissolve the marriage, and you walk away untouched by their financial collapse. I looked at the two men who managed my father's empire. I thought about Valerie calling me a gold digger in my own kitchen. I thought about Chloe mocking my dress. I thought about Preston laughing at my career. And most importantly, I thought about Julian telling me to sit quietly by the kitchen doors so he could pretend to be a titan of industry. Walking away is not enough, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy calm. My father did not teach me to walk away when an enemy tries to burn down my house. He taught me to buy the battlefield. I turned my attention fully to Jonathan. We have the Apex Holdings LLC shell company, correct? Correct, the one completely anonymized with non-disclosure agreements. Yes, Jonathan confirmed, looking slightly confused by my pivot. It is fully funded and untraceable to you personally. Good, I replied. I do not want to just watch Preston and Julian go bankrupt. I want to be the one who owns their debt. Jonathan, I want Apex Holdings to aggressively buy up every single bad loan Preston has on the market. I want you to buy the paper on Julian's leveraged tech shares. I want to become their biggest creditor by the end of the week. Attorney Caldwell let out a low whistle, a rare break in his stoic professional demeanor. You want to acquire their debt, Camille. If you do that, you essentially own them. You will have total legal authority to liquidate Preston's firm and seize Julian's shares. You will be their master. Exactly, I said, leaning back in the plush leather chair, a cold smile finally reaching my lips. They are desperate for a corporate buyout to save them from federal ruin. Let us give them exactly what they want. We are going to offer to buy Preston's firm through Apex Holdings. We are going to let them think they have been saved by a mysterious billionaire investor. We are going to let them pop champagne and celebrate their brilliant business acumen. And then I added, my eyes locked on the projected financial charts. When the time comes to sign the final acquisition paperwork, I am going to walk into that boardroom and take absolutely everything they have. The silence in the boardroom after my declaration was heavy, but it was not the silence of hesitation. It was the silence of professionals recognizing a fundamental shift in command. Attorney Caldwell slowly took off his reading glasses, placing them neatly on the polished mahogany table. Jonathan closed his laptop halfway, his eyes locked on mine. They had spent years managing my father's wealth, executing safe, conservative growth strategies designed for long-term preservation. They had never seen me use the portfolio as a weapon, until today. Jonathan cleared his throat, a sharp professional sound that broke the tension in the room. He opened his laptop fully again, his fingers flying across the keyboard. The massive screen at the end of the room shifted from the red bleeding charts of Preston's failing venture capital firm to a blank, pristine spreadsheet. If we are going to do this, Camille, we have to move with absolute precision, Jonathan said, his voice dropping into a rapid, tactical cadence. Preston owes money to 3 highly aggressive private equity groups and a handful of predatory lenders in Delaware. Those people are sharks. They know his firm is sinking, and they are desperate to offload his toxic debt before he files for federal bankruptcy and leaves them with pennies on the dollar. And my husband, I asked, my voice completely steady. Julian's tech shares are heavily leveraged through a secondary brokerage, Jonathan explained, pulling up a new dataset. He essentially used his unvested company stock as collateral to secure short-term loans for Preston. If we operate through Apex Holdings, we can approach these lenders completely anonymously. We offer to buy the debt portfolios off their hands at a slight premium. They get out of a bad investment with their capital intact, and in exchange, Apex Holdings becomes the sole legal both Preston Vanguard Capital and your husband's equity. Attorney Caldwell leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. You need to understand the legal reality of this maneuver, Camille. When you acquire this debt, you are not erasing it. You are simply taking the leash from the banks and wrapping it around your own hand. The moment Apex Holdings holds the paper, you have total legal authority to call in the loans, liquidate their assets, or seize their companies if they default. You will own their professional lives. I looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling Washington, D.C. skyline. I thought about my father. General Thomas had been a man of immense quiet dignity. He had grown up with nothing, fought his way to the highest ranks of the military, and built a $58 million empire through sheer uncompromising discipline. He had never once boasted about his wealth. He had always told me that a loud man is a weak man, and that true power never needs to announce its arrival. Valerie and her children had mocked his legacy. They had called him a rigid man with a government pension. They had looked down on me because I chose to preserve history instead of flashing designer labels at country clubs. They had forged my signature to steal from my future, convinced I was too small and too stupid to fight back. I turned back to the table, my decision absolute. Do it, I said. Authorize the release of whatever capital is necessary from the primary reserve accounts. I want Apex Holdings to aggressively buy up every single bad loan Preston has on the market. I want you to buy the paper on Julian's leveraged tech shares. I want the predatory lenders bought out by tomorrow afternoon. Leave absolutely no trace back to me. Jonathan nodded, a rare, predatory smile touching the corners of his mouth. Consider it done. We will deploy the funds through 3 different subsidiary shell companies to mask the sheer volume of the capital movement. By Friday, Apex Holdings will be the apex predator in their financial ecosystem. I spent the next 2 hours in that boardroom signing authorization forms. The physical act of moving millions of dollars was strangely mundane. It was just ink on paper, but with every signature, I was quietly securing another nail in my new family's coffin. When I finally walked out of the building and stepped into the humid afternoon air, I felt lighter than I had in months. Returning to the Maryland suburbs required an Oscar-worthy performance. I pulled my car into our driveway just as the sun was setting. Julian's luxury sedan was already parked in the garage. I walked through the front door, placed my keys in the ceramic bowl on the console table, and took a deep breath, slipping the mask of the naive, supportive wife back onto my face. Julian was pacing the length of our living room. He had a glass of bourbon in his hand, and his expensive silk tie was hanging loosely around his neck. The arrogant, dismissive executive who had drained our bank account was nowhere to be found. In his place was a frantic, terrified man who knew the walls were closing in. "Hey," I said softly, walking into the room and setting my tote bag on the sofa. "Is everything okay? You seem stressed." Julian stopped pacing and glared at me. The sheer audacity of his resentment was almost laughable. He took a heavy swallow of his drink, his eyes bloodshot and frantic. "Of course I am stressed, Camille." He snapped, his voice sharp with misplaced aggression. "But I do not expect you to understand. I am dealing with high-level capital issues. Preston and I are navigating some complex equity restructuring. It is a lot of pressure ensuring this family stays at the top of the food chain. You just get to go to the archives and look at old books all day. You have no idea what it takes to carry this kind of financial burden." I looked at the man who had forged my name on a federal loan document just to appease his mother's vanity. I looked at the man who had allowed his sister to mock my clothes and his brother-in-law to degrade my career. He was standing in the living room of a house he had secretly mortgaged to the hilt, lecturing me about financial burdens. I did not scream. I did not throw the bourbon in his face. I simply offered him a gentle, reassuring smile. "You are right, Julian," I said, keeping my tone perfectly mild. "I could never understand the kind of pressure you and Preston are under. I am just glad you are so capable of handling our future." He scoffed, turning his back to me to pour another drink at the bar cart. Just make sure we do not have any unnecessary expenses this month, he muttered over his shoulder. I need our cash flow perfectly streamlined right now. No shopping, no dining out. We have to be disciplined. The irony was so thick I could have cut it with a knife. I nodded obediently, walked upstairs to the master bathroom, turned on the shower, and finally allowed myself to laugh. It was a cold, quiet laugh that echoed off the porcelain tiles. Over the next 48 hours, my phone buzzed constantly with encrypted updates from Jonathan. The speed and efficiency of my father's wealth management team were breathtaking. While Julian paced our house, snapping at me over minor inconveniences and drinking himself into a stupor every night, Apex Holdings was quietly swallowing his entire world. On Thursday morning, Jonathan confirmed that we had successfully acquired the second mortgage on our Maryland home from the predatory lenders in Delaware. On Thursday afternoon, we secured the debt portfolio belonging to Preston's failing venture capital firm. By Friday morning, Apex Holdings officially held the paperwork for all of Julian's leveraged tech shares. I owned the roof over his head. I owned his brother-in-law's fraudulent empire. I owned his entire professional future, and he was completely oblivious. The real masterpiece of the trap was set into motion on Saturday morning. Julian was sitting at the kitchen island staring blankly at his laptop, his face pale with exhaustion. The panic of impending federal bankruptcy was clearly eating him alive. He jumped violently when his cell phone suddenly rang, shattering the quiet of the house. He snatched the phone off the marble counter, his eyes widening when he saw Preston's name on the caller ID. He answered it immediately, putting the phone on speaker as he scrambled to pull up a financial document on his screen. "Preston, tell me you have good news," Julian said, his voice cracking with desperation. "The private lenders are threatening to call in the margins on Monday. If they do that, my tech shares are wiped out. I lose everything, man. We lose the house." A loud, booming laugh echoed through the phone speaker. Preston sounded absolutely euphoric. The suffocating tension that had gripped my husband for a week vanished as Preston's triumphant voice filled the kitchen. "Relax, Julian," Preston shouted, the sound of a champagne cork popping clearly audible in the background. "We did it, man. I told you I would pull us through. I just got off the phone with a corporate liaison for a private equity group called Apex Holdings. They are a massive anonymous institutional investor. They just bought out all of our hostile creditors, every single one of them." Julian slumped forward over the kitchen island, burying his face in his free hand, as a massive wave of relief washed over him. He let out a shaky, triumphant breath. "Are you serious? They bought the debt?" "Better than that," Preston boasted, his massive ego fully restored. "They are not just buying the debt, Julian. They want to acquire my entire firm. They want to bring your tech equity under their umbrella. They see the vision, man. They recognize the value we bring to the table. We are going to be operating with billions in institutional backing. Valerie is already calling the country club to arrange a celebration dinner for next week." I stood by the coffee maker, wiping down the counter with a microfiber cloth, listening to them celebrate their own brilliant business acumen. They truly believed they had manifested a miracle. They believed their sheer elite status had attracted a mysterious billionaire savior to rescue them from the consequences of their own spectacular failures. "We have a mandatory acquisition meeting set for Tuesday evening." Preston continued, his voice dripping with absolute arrogance. "They want the whole family there to sign the final transition paperwork. Wear your best suit, Julian. We are walking into the big leagues now." Julian hung up the phone. He looked up at me, his eyes shining with renewed toxic arrogance. The pathetic, terrified man was gone. The entitled, condescending executive was back. "See that?" Camille, Julian said, gesturing vaguely at his laptop. "That is why you do not question my financial strategies. I took a calculated risk, and now Preston and I are being backed by an institutional heavyweight. We are about to be untouchable. This is how real wealth operates." I smiled at him. It was the most genuine smile I had given him since the day I walked down the aisle. "I am so proud of you, Julian," I said softly. "I cannot wait to see exactly how untouchable you really are." The beauty of being a rare document archivist is that you learn the profound virtue of absolute patience. You learn that history is not made in loud, explosive moments, but in the quiet, methodical arrangement of facts. On Monday morning, while my husband was busy polishing his fragile ego and preparing for another week of pretending to be a tech titan, I went to work at the Historical Society. I put on my white cotton gloves, sat down under the soft fluorescent lights of the preservation room, and carefully restored a letter from the 18th century. My phone rested silently on the stainless steel table next to my magnifying glass. It was strictly against protocol to have personal devices in the preservation room, but I had made an exception today. Today was the day Apex Holdings would officially swallow my husband's entire professional existence. At exactly 10:15 in the morning, the phone screen illuminated. It was a secure encrypted message from Jonathan, my lead wealth manager at the firm. The message contained only 3 words: acquisition complete. Check email. I carefully placed the historical letter back into its acid-free protective sleeve, removed my cotton gloves, and opened my secure email portal. What Jonathan and Attorney Caldwell had accomplished over the weekend was nothing short of a financial massacre. They had not just purchased the toxic debt Preston had accumulated. They had used the massive liquidity of my father's blind trust to execute a rapid, aggressive equity buyout of Julian's employer, a mid-level firm called Nexus Dynamics. Nexus Dynamics had been struggling for months, desperate for an injection of institutional capital to stay afloat. The board of directors had been practically begging for a buyout. Apex Holdings had swooped in as a faceless corporate savior. Through a series of aggressive market maneuvers, Jonathan had purchased 51% of the voting shares. I scrolled through the legal documentation reading the terms of the acquisition. The corporate non-disclosure agreements were absolute and ironclad. No one at Nexus Dynamics, not the chief executive officer, not the board of directors, and certainly not my mid-level executive husband, had any idea who actually owned Apex Holdings. To them, Apex was just a massive anonymous private equity firm based out of Washington, D.C. But looking at the final page of the acquisition summary, the reality of my new position settled over me. I was now the majority shareholder of Nexus Dynamics. I owned the building Julian walked into every morning. I owned the servers his team operated on. I controlled the board that dictated his salary, his bonuses, and his employment contract. I was in every legal and financial sense of the word, my husband's ultimate boss. And because Apex Holdings had also purchased Preston's bad loans, I was now the sole creditor holding the paper on Julian's leveraged stock options. I literally owned the man. I owned his present and I owned his future. The intoxicating thrill of absolute power washed over me, but I kept my face perfectly blank. I locked my phone, put my white cotton gloves back on, and returned to my archiving work. I had a husband to face at home, and I needed to ensure my performance as the clueless dependent wife remained absolutely flawless. When I pulled into the driveway of our Maryland home that evening, I could hear the loud, obnoxious thumping of bass-heavy music vibrating through the front windows. I walked through the door to find Julian standing in the kitchen, pouring an absurdly expensive bottle of champagne into 2 crystal glasses. He was practically vibrating with a manic, euphoric energy. He had taken off his suit jacket, rolled up his sleeves, and was grinning like a man who had just won the lottery. "Babe, get in here," Julian shouted over the music, waving me over to the marble island. "We are celebrating." I walked into the kitchen, setting my modest tote bag on a bar stool. I looked at the champagne bottle, noting the vintage. It was a $200 bottle of wine purchased by a man who currently had less than $40 to his name in our joint checking account. "What are we celebrating, Julian?" I asked, letting a note of innocent confusion enter my voice. "Did you get the promotion?" Julian laughed, a loud, booming sound full of pure arrogance. "Promotion. Camille, I am thinking way bigger than a simple promotion. The entire game just changed today. Nexus Dynamics just got acquired. We were bought out by a massive private equity firm called Apex Holdings. It is an absolute game changer." He slid a glass of champagne across the marble counter toward me. He leaned in close, his eyes wide with greed and self-importance. "They bought a controlling stake in the company," Julian explained, using his hands to emphasize his words as if he were delivering a keynote address. "The CEO held an emergency all-hands meeting this afternoon to announce the merger. Apex Holdings is injecting millions into our infrastructure. And the best part? The acquisition triggered an acceleration clause in my employment contract. All of my unvested stock options are going to be fully vested by the end of the quarter. I am going to be cashing out at a premium. I picked up the crystal glass, looking at the bubbles rising to the surface. It took every ounce of self-control I possessed not to laugh directly in his face. He had no idea that the acceleration clause he was bragging about was completely worthless. He had already pledged those exact stock options to Preston as collateral for a loan that Preston had subsequently defaulted on. Those shares belong to Apex Holdings now. They belong to me. That sounds incredibly complicated, Julian, I said, playing the role of the simple-minded archivist. What does a private equity buyout actually mean for your daily work? Will you have a new boss? Julian scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. You do not need to worry about the corporate mechanics, Camille. I know this high-level finance stuff goes right over your head. Just know that your husband is about to be a very wealthy, very powerful man. The new owners are completely anonymous. Some billionaire investment group hiding behind a wall of lawyers. But they clearly recognize the value of my division. Preston and I are going to leverage this momentum to take over the entire tech sector in this city. I took a slow sip of the champagne. It was dry and crisp, tasting exactly like victory. I am so happy for you, Julian, I murmured softly. It sounds like everything is falling perfectly into place. It is, he agreed, pulling his phone from his pocket as it began to ring. It is my mom. She has been calling everyone in the family all afternoon since Preston gave her the news. Julian answered the call, putting it on speakerphone and setting it on the kitchen island so he could pour himself another glass of champagne. Valerie's shrill, excited voice immediately filled the room. Julian, darling, Valerie practically squealed through the speaker. Preston just told me the incredible news about the Apex Holdings acquisition. I am absolutely vibrating with pride. I always knew my son was destined to operate at the highest echelons of wealth. This is exactly the kind of institutional backing our family deserves. Thank you, Mom, Julian said, puffing out his chest and leaning against the counter. It is a massive win for all of us. Preston and I are already discussing how to position ourselves with the new board of directors. Of course you are, Valerie crooned. We need to celebrate this properly. This elevates our entire social standing in the Potomac circuit. I am organizing a special Sunday brunch at the country club this weekend. I have already reserved the private dining room on the terrace. I am inviting some very important people who need to see the new elevated trajectory of this family. That sounds perfect, Julian agreed instantly. What time should we be there? Noon, Valerie commanded. And Julian, make sure you dress the part. We are leaving the struggle years behind us. We are moving into a completely different tax bracket now. I need my son looking like the titan he is about to become. There was a brief pause on the line. I knew exactly what Valerie was thinking about. She was thinking about the fact that her newly minted, allegedly wealthy son was still legally shackled to a woman she despised. And make sure Camille wears something appropriate, Valerie added her voice, dropping its joyful tone and replacing it with a sharp, familiar disdain. I do not want her showing up to the country club looking like she just crawled out of a library basement. Tell her to buy a decent dress. Put it on a credit card if she has to. We cannot have her embarrassing you in front of the guests I am bringing. Julian did not even flinch. He did not defend me. He simply looked at me, gave a dismissive little shrug, and spoke into the phone. Do not worry, Mom. I will make sure she looks presentable. I will see you on Sunday. He ended the call, tossed his phone onto the counter, and picked up his champagne glass again. He looked at me with a lazy, arrogant smile, completely oblivious to the danger he was in. He thought he was untouchable. He thought his mother's approval and Preston's validation made him a king. He thought he had successfully secured his financial future while keeping me firmly trapped under his thumb. I looked at the man who had stolen my money, forged my name, and allowed his mother to degrade me in my own home. I smiled back at him, feeling the absolute terrifying power of the $58 million secret burning quietly in my chest. I could not wait for Sunday brunch. Sunday morning arrived with a bright and completely unforgiving sunlight that poured through the expansive windows of our Maryland home. Julian spent nearly an hour standing in front of his full-length mirror, meticulously adjusting his custom-tailored suit. He was practically buzzing with a toxic manic energy. The news of the Apex Holdings buyout had completely inflated his already fragile ego, turning him into a man who truly believed he had conquered the world. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not compliment the soft emerald dress I had chosen for the occasion. He simply grabbed his keys and told me not to embarrass him in front of his mother. The drive to the Oakwood Country Club was excruciating. Julian spent the entire 30-minute trip bragging about how he was going to leverage his newly vested stock options to buy a luxury sports car. He talked endlessly about how Preston was going to introduce him to the absolute highest tier of Washington society. I sat in the passenger seat looking out the window at the passing trees, nodding politely at all the right intervals. I listened to my husband plan a lavish future using money that currently belonged to my shadow corporation. It was a bizarre out-of-body experience. I was sitting next to a man who was enthusiastically digging his own financial grave, completely unaware that I was holding the shovel. When we pulled into the circular driveway of the country club, the valet rushed forward to open Julian's door. The club was a monument to exclusionary wealth, boasting sprawling manicured golf courses, massive stone columns, and an atmosphere thick with old money arrogance. We walked through the grand lobby and out onto the sunlit stone terrace. I spotted Valerie instantly. She was holding court at a large prime table situated right near the edge of the terrace, offering a perfect view of the 18th hole. Preston and Chloe were already seated sipping expensive mimosas and laughing loudly. But there was a fifth person sitting at the table. As we approached, my heart did not flutter with jealousy, but my jaw certainly tightened with absolute disbelief at Valerie's sheer audacity. Sitting directly to the right of Valerie was Lauren. I knew exactly who Lauren was. She was Julian's ex-girlfriend. They had dated for 3 years before Julian and I met. Lauren was an African-American heiress whose family owned massive commercial real estate developments across the entire East Coast. She was everything Valerie had ever wanted in a daughter-in-law. She was extraordinarily wealthy, fiercely obsessed with social status, and completely willing to play Valerie's vicious high society games. Valerie stood up as we reached the table, her face breaking into a massive theatrical smile. She completely bypassed me, throwing her arms around Julian and kissing him on both cheeks. "Julian, darling," Valerie projected her voice so the neighboring tables could hear. "I am so incredibly proud of you. Preston told me all about the massive private equity acquisition. You are an absolute titan. Come sit down. Look who I invited to celebrate your massive success." Julian looked at Lauren. I watched the immediate pathetic shift in my husband's posture. He puffed out his chest, running a hand over his expensive tie, his eyes lighting up with desperate validation. He completely forgot I was standing right beside him. He walked eagerly to the empty chair directly between his mother and his ex-girlfriend, pulling it out and sitting down with a bright, charming smile. Lauren leaned over, placing a perfectly manicured hand directly onto Julian's forearm. "It is so wonderful to see you, Julian," she purred, batting her eyelashes. "Valerie has been telling me all about your company being bought out by Apex Holdings. She says you are about to be operating with billions in institutional backing. I always knew you were destined for absolute greatness." Julian beamed, soaking up her praise like a man dying of thirst. He immediately launched into a highly exaggerated story about his role in the tech company, taking full credit for attracting the anonymous billionaire investors. He boasted about his stock options. He bragged about the upcoming transition meetings. He was putting on a pathetic, desperate performance to impress a woman who represented the elite lifestyle he was so desperate to claim. I was left standing awkwardly at the edge of the table. No one had offered me a seat. No one had even acknowledged my arrival. Chloe noticed me hovering and let out a short, mocking laugh. "Oh, Camille," Chloe said, gesturing vaguely toward a chair at the very far end of the table, as far away from Julian as physically possible. "You can sit over there next to Preston. We were not sure if you would actually show up today, considering this is a celebration of real financial achievement." I pulled out the chair and sat down silently. I placed my hands in my lap, feeling the cool metal of my wedding band against my skin. I looked down the table at my husband. He was leaning in close to Lauren, whispering something that made her throw her head back in a loud, melodic laugh. He did not look my way once. He was completely comfortable disrespecting our marriage in public to appease his mother's sick, manipulative games. The brunch proceeded in a haze of sickening excess. Preston ordered multiple bottles of vintage champagne, loudly toasting to their impending wealth. Valerie directed every single topic of conversation toward Lauren, asking pointed questions about her family's latest real estate acquisitions and her recent vacations to Dubai. They were intentionally excluding me, trying to make me feel small, irrelevant, and entirely out of place in their circle of supposed greatness. Then Valerie ordered the waiter to clear the main plates so they could serve dessert. The terrace was buzzing with conversations from the other wealthy patrons, but Valerie leaned forward, resting her elbows on the white tablecloth. She looked past Lauren, past Julian, and locked her cold, predatory eyes directly onto mine. The casual chatter at our table died down. Chloe smirked, pulling her phone out to text someone while Preston sat back and watched the incoming slaughter with a highly amused expression. Camille Valerie began, her voice smooth and venomous. I am sure sitting here today has been quite overwhelming for you. It must be very difficult to witness the kind of monumental wealth and power that Julian is stepping into. It is a world you clearly do not understand, and frankly a world you do not belong in. I kept my face completely blank. I did not avert my gaze. I stared right back into her eyes, waiting for the final blow. You see, Valerie continued, raising her champagne glass slightly. Julian is moving into the absolute upper echelon of Washington society. He is going to be sitting in boardrooms with billionaires. He is going to be running an empire alongside Preston. A man of his stature requires a partner who understands how to operate at that level. A man like Julian needs a woman who can elevate him. He needs someone with the proper pedigree, the proper resources, and the proper connections to solidify his legacy. She turned her head slowly, smiling warmly at Lauren, who practically glowed under the praise. Then Valerie snapped her gaze back to me. Let us be completely honest with each other, Camille. Valerie said, her voice dropping to a harsh, cruel pitch, so only our table could hear the absolute devastation in her words. You are just a temporary placeholder. You were a convenient little distraction while Julian was building his foundation. But now that he has arrived, you are nothing but an anchor holding him down. You are just going to occupy space in his house until his new stock options officially vest, and he can finally afford to pay for the divorce lawyers to get rid of you. The words struck the table like a physical weapon. The utter, breathtaking cruelty of her statement was horrifying. She had just told me in front of my husband's ex-girlfriend and his entire family that my marriage was a waiting room for a divorce. She had completely stripped away any remaining illusion of human decency. I did not look at Valerie. I turned my head and looked directly at Julian. I looked at the man who had promised to protect my heart. I looked at the man I had trusted implicitly. Julian heard every single word his mother said. He knew exactly how violent, how humiliating, and how profoundly disrespectful that statement was. He looked back at me. He did not frown. He did not stand up. He did not tell his mother to stop. Julian actually smirked. It was a small, arrogant, cowardly smirk. He picked up his crystal glass of mimosa, took a slow, deliberate sip, and then turned his body completely away from me to resume his whispered, flirtatious conversation with Lauren. He endorsed his mother's cruelty. He validated my execution. He did absolutely nothing. I sat there in the blinding sunlight of the country club terrace. My chest did not heave with sobs. My eyes did not fill with tears. The last remaining fragment of love I held for Julian dissolved into absolutely nothing. He was not a victim of his mother's manipulation. He was an active, willing participant in my abuse. They thought this was their ultimate victory. They thought they had finally broken the quiet archivist, reducing me to a silent, humiliated placeholder who would simply endure their torture because I had nowhere else to go. They were so blinded by their own arrogance, so obsessed with their fake prestige, that they could not sense the absolute inferno of destruction waiting for them just beyond the horizon. I looked at Julian's smug face one last time. The time for gathering intelligence was over. It was time to burn it all down. I did not throw my glass of water in Valerie's face. I did not scream at Julian. I did not give Chloe the satisfaction of seeing a single tear fall from my eyes. The table was suffocatingly quiet, save for the ambient noise of the country club terrace around us. They were all waiting for my breakdown. They wanted a performance. They wanted the hysterical, heartbroken wife they could point to and label as unstable and ungrateful. I simply placed my white linen napkin on the table and stood up. The scraping of my chair against the stone patio sounded incredibly loud in the tense silence. I looked down at my husband. He had already turned his attention back to Lauren, his ex-girlfriend, completely dismissing my existence as if I were a ghost, hovering at the edge of his new elite reality. He was so desperate for Valerie's approval that he was willing to watch me be slaughtered in public. "You are absolutely right, Valerie," I said, my voice perfectly level and calm. "I am just a temporary placeholder, and my time here is officially done. Enjoy your celebration." I turned my back on them and walked away. I did not rush. I walked with my head held high, my posture straight, feeling the warmth of the Sunday sun on my skin. I could feel their eyes on my back, probably exchanging smug, victorious smiles, completely convinced they had successfully bullied the poor, uncultured archivist out of their elite family circle. I imagined Chloe leaning in to whisper a cruel joke to Lauren. I imagined Julian breathing a heavy sigh of relief that his embarrassment of a wife was finally out of the picture. Let them revel in their fake victory. I had a war to win. The drive back to our Maryland home was the most peaceful 30 minutes I had experienced since the day I got married. The deep, agonizing knot of anxiety that had lived in my chest for weeks completely dissolved. I pulled into the driveway of the massive house Julian had secretly mortgaged to fund his brother-in-law's failing venture capital firm. The house was quiet and entirely empty. I walked upstairs to the master bedroom and pulled a single modest duffel bag from the closet. I did not pack the expensive gifts from our wedding registry. I did not take the jewelry Julian had bought me on credit to keep up his appearances. I only packed what truly belonged to me: my comfortable clothes, my document preservation tools, and the few framed photographs I had of my father, General Thomas. I stood in the center of the massive walk-in closet and looked at Julian's side. His expensive, tailored suits lined the walls, a physical manifestation of a man desperately trying to look like a king while drowning in a sea of toxic debt. I felt absolutely nothing for him. No anger, no sorrow, just a cold, clinical detachment. He was no longer my husband. He was a bad investment I was about to liquidate. I walked downstairs to the kitchen and stood at the marble island. This was the exact spot where Valerie had ambushed me with her corporate lawyer. This was the spot where Julian had stood by and watched me sign away my rights to his imaginary fortune, forcing me to agree that our premarital assets would never be commingled. I reached into my purse, pulled out my heavy brass house key, and placed it right in the center of the marble counter. It landed with a quiet final clink. I walked out the front door, pulled my suitcase to my car, and drove away. I was leaving them to their beautiful, fragile delusions. As I navigated onto the highway, heading toward a luxury long-term hotel suite, my wealth management team had discreetly booked for me in downtown Washington. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat. I pressed the button on my steering wheel to answer the call through the car's Bluetooth system. It was Jonathan, my lead wealth manager at the firm. "Camille," Jonathan said, his professional voice carrying a distinct note of deep satisfaction, "the final trap has been set. I am initiating the call to Preston Vanguard Capital right now. My corporate acquisition team is dialing his cell phone as we speak. Put me on a secure, muted conference line," I instructed, a slow smile finally breaking across my face. "I want to hear every single word." There was a brief click, and then the line connected. I was a silent ghost on the call, listening as a senior acquisition director from my shadow corporation, Apex Holdings, dialed Preston's personal cell phone. I could hear the ambient noise of the country club terrace through the phone speaker. Preston answered on the second ring, his voice loud and bloated with arrogance, undoubtedly trying to impress Valerie and Julian's wealthy ex-girlfriend at the brunch table. "Preston speaking," he answered, the clinking of crystal glasses audible in the background. "Mr. Preston, this is David Montgomery, Director of Acquisitions at Apex Holdings," my representative said smoothly. "I am calling to officially inform you that our board of directors has reviewed your portfolio. We are prepared to execute a complete corporate buyout of Preston Vanguard Capital effective immediately. We are also finalizing the absorption of Nexus Dynamics, bringing your brother-in-law's tech division under our direct management. We are prepared to clear all of your outstanding debt and inject a massive wave of institutional capital into your operations. I drove down the highway, listening to the absolute silence that fell over Preston on the other end of the line. I could perfectly picture the scene unfolding on the sunlit terrace. Preston's face flushing with shock and overwhelming greed. Julian leaning forward, desperate for good news. Valerie pausing her conversation with Lauren, sensing that a monumental shift in power was happening right in front of her. "Are you serious?" Preston finally choked out, his voice cracking with sheer unadulterated joy. "A complete buyout. You are clearing the debt ledgers. We are assuming all financial liabilities and taking a controlling interest in your combined ventures," my director confirmed. "We believe your family's portfolio has unique potential. However, we require a mandatory in-person acquisition meeting tomorrow evening at our headquarters in downtown Washington. We need you, your wife, your mother-in-law, and Julian present to sign the final transition paperwork. Our anonymous primary investor wishes to meet the family personally before the ink dries." "Yes, absolutely," Preston practically shouted into the phone, the sound of his chair scraping against the stone patio as he likely stood up in excitement. "We will be there. Send me the address." "Thank you, David. You have no idea what a brilliant investment Apex Holdings is making today." The call disconnected. I stayed on the line with Jonathan. "They took the bait," Jonathan said, chuckling softly. "They are probably popping another bottle of champagne right now." "They are," I replied, staring at the road ahead. "They think they just won the lottery. They think their elite status and fake prestige finally attracted a billionaire savior to wipe away their sins." Back at the country club, I knew exactly what was happening. Preston was slamming his phone down on the table, announcing to Valerie, Chloe, Julian, and Lauren that they were officially untouchable. I could imagine Valerie raising her mimosa, boasting loudly about how her family was destined for greatness, claiming that cutting away my dead weight had opened the door for this exact blessing. I could picture Julian looking smug and validated, completely convinced that letting his mother drive me away was the best decision he had ever made. They were celebrating their survival. They were toasting to a future filled with mansions, yachts, and high society galas. They were popping champagne and patting each other on the back, completely and blissfully unaware that they were celebrating their own execution. I pulled into the underground parking garage of my luxury hotel suite. I turned off the car engine and sat in the quiet dark for a moment. Tomorrow evening I would walk into that corporate boardroom. I would look at the family who had called me a gold digger, a placeholder, and an ugly, dusty archivist. I would watch the realization wash over their faces when they realized the anonymous billionaire investor they were bowing down to was the very woman they had just discarded. I gathered my single duffel bag from the passenger seat and walked toward the elevator. The game was over. It was time to collect my winnings. Monday evening descended upon Washington, D.C., with a heavy, humid heat. But inside the executive suite of the K Street high-rise, the climate was controlled to an absolute icy perfection. I stood in the private viewing room adjacent to the main corporate boardroom, separated only by a wall of soundproof one-way mirrored glass. The room was entirely dark, except for the soft blue glow of the security monitors. I was not wearing my usual practical archivist clothes. I was wearing a bespoke, charcoal gray designer suit paired with a silk blouse and a pair of stilettos that felt like armor. My hair was pulled back into a sleek, unforgiving style. I looked exactly like the woman my father had raised me to be. A commander preparing to survey a surrendered battlefield. Through the glass, I had a perfect, unobstructed view of the massive mahogany boardroom table. Attorney Caldwell and Jonathan were already seated near the top of the table, flanked by 4 junior corporate litigators who were busy arranging thick stacks of acquisition contracts. They looked like an execution squad dressed in Brooks Brothers suits. At exactly 6 o'clock, the heavy double doors at the far end of the boardroom swung open. The arrival of my soon-to-be former family was a spectacular display of completely unearned arrogance. They walked into the room as if they already owned the building. Preston led the pack, practically strutting across the plush carpet. He was wearing a flashy pinstriped suit that screamed new money desperation, checking his luxury watch with an exaggerated flick of his wrist. Julian followed close behind him, looking nervously eager. He had clearly spent hours grooming himself, his hair perfectly lined up, his posture stiff as he tried to mimic Preston's bloated confidence. Chloe and Valerie brought up the rear, and their appearance was almost comical in its excess. Chloe was dripping in obvious designer logos, carrying a handbag that I knew for a fact cost more than Julian's annual car payments. Valerie, however, was the true masterpiece of delusion. She glided into the corporate boardroom wearing a cocktail dress and a diamond tennis necklace, treating a federal financial acquisition meeting like it was a red carpet event at her country club. I stood in the shadows behind the glass, crossing my arms over my chest, listening to the crystal-clear audio feed piped into my viewing room. "Good evening, gentlemen!" Preston boomed, his loud voice echoing aggressively off the glass walls. He did not wait to be invited to sit. He marched directly to the center of the mahogany table, pulling out the most prominent chair for himself. "Preston Vanguard Capital has arrived. Let us get this paperwork signed so we can all go celebrate. I have reservations at a Michelin-starred steakhouse at 8. Attorney Caldwell did not smile. He simply folded his hands on the table and looked at Preston with the cold, detached gaze of a mortician. "Please take a seat, Mr. Preston," Caldwell said smoothly. "We have a few final details to review before the primary investor arrives to execute the signatures." Valerie elegantly lowered herself into a plush leather chair next to Julian. She looked around the immaculate, intimidating boardroom with a deeply satisfied sigh. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the polished wood, and smiled brightly at Jonathan. "I must say your firm has exceptional timing," Valerie announced, completely unprompted. "It takes a certain caliber of institutional intelligence to recognize the sheer untapped potential in my son and my son-in-law. We have been waiting for a private equity partner operating at our level. Our family has a very specific legacy to uphold in this city, and it is so refreshing to finally partner with people who understand true wealth generation." I watched Jonathan nod politely, his face a perfect mask of corporate neutrality. "I appreciate your confidence, ma'am," Jonathan replied. "We certainly recognize something unique in your family's financial portfolio." Preston laughed loudly, leaning back and throwing one arm over the back of his chair. "Unique is one way to put it. Disruptive is another. I have been telling Julian here that once Apex Holdings clears our short-term liabilities, we are going to completely monopolize the tech incubator space. With my vision and Julian's software division, your anonymous boss is going to see a tenfold return by the fourth quarter. We just needed someone with deep enough pockets to let us operate without constraints." Julian eagerly nodded along, desperate to prove his worth to the men in the sharp suits. "Exactly," Julian chimed in, his voice slightly higher than usual from the adrenaline. "My team at Nexus Dynamics is perfectly positioned for this merger. I have already drafted a completely restructured organizational chart. I am ready to step into the executive vice president role the moment the ink is dry. I thrive under this kind of high-level pressure." I stared at my husband through the glass. He was sitting there promising the moon and the stars, entirely oblivious to the fact that his stock options were completely worthless and his tech company had been swallowed whole. He looked so small, so pathetic, playing the role of a corporate titan while literally begging for a bailout. Valerie reached out and patted Julian's arm affectionately, beaming with toxic pride. "My Julian is so dedicated to his craft," Valerie boasted to Caldwell, and Jonathan treating the lawyers like an audience at a society luncheon. And honestly, this acquisition could not have come at a better time for him personally. He is going to have so much more energy to dedicate to the firm now that he has cleared away some very unfortunate domestic distractions. My breath hitched slightly in the dark viewing room. She was actually doing it. She was bringing up our marriage in a corporate acquisition meeting. Jonathan tilted his head, playing along effortlessly. Domestic distractions. I hope nothing that would interfere with his executive duties. "Oh, heavens, no." Valerie laughed, a sharp, ringing sound that made my blood run cold. Quite the opposite. Julian recently realized that his brief starter marriage was a complete liability. He married a very sweet, very simple girl who worked as a librarian. No ambition, no financial literacy, absolutely no pedigree. She simply could not handle the pressure of operating in our social stratosphere. She actually walked out yesterday after throwing a tantrum at the country club because she felt intimidated by our circles. It was a blessing in disguise, really. Now Julian is completely unencumbered and ready to focus on building his empire. Chloe snickered, picking up her crystal water glass. She could not even afford a decent dress for the country club, Chloe added viciously. Julian was practically carrying her on his back. Good riddance. I watched Julian's reaction. I watched the man who had cried at our altar just weeks ago. He did not correct his mother. He did not tell his sister to show some respect. He simply offered a modest, self-deprecating shrug to the lawyers across the table. "It is what it is," Julian muttered, trying to sound like a stoic, focused businessman who had just shed a bad investment. We had different visions for the future. I am focused on capital growth, and she just did not fit the corporate culture I am building. I am ready to move forward. The absolute breathtaking audacity of their delusion was a marvel to witness. They were sitting in a boardroom. They did not own begging for money to cover fraudulent loans. They could not pay while openly mocking the woman who actually held the deed to their entire lives. They were writing their own obituaries with every single arrogant word they spoke. Attorney Caldwell glanced at the heavy silver clock on the wall. He gathered the thick stack of acquisition contracts, aligning the edges perfectly against the mahogany table. "Well, Mr. Preston," Julian Caldwell said, his voice dropping an octave, signaling a shift in the atmosphere. "It sounds like your family is completely aligned and ready for a new chapter. Our primary investor has just arrived and is ready to review the final terms of your liquidation and acquisition." Preston sat up straight, buttoning his suit jacket. Julian smoothed his tie, his eyes fixed eagerly on the grand double doors at the end of the room. Valerie sat back with a triumphant, regal smile, absolutely certain that a billionaire was about to walk through those doors and hand her family the keys to the kingdom. I stepped away from the one-way glass. I picked up the leather folder containing the signed post-nuptial agreement, the forged mortgage documents, and the finalized divorce papers. I walked out of the viewing room and moved down the silent carpeted hallway toward the main entrance of the boardroom. The anticipation inside that room was electric. I could feel it radiating through the heavy wooden doors. They were waiting for their savior. They were waiting for the anonymous titan of industry to validate their greed and crown them as Washington elite. I placed my hand on the brass handle of the heavy mahogany door. I took one final steadying breath, completely shedding the quiet, unassuming archivist I had been my entire life. I pushed the doors open and walked into the blinding light. I pushed the heavy mahogany doors open. They swung inward with a smooth, silent glide, revealing the sprawling expanse of the executive boardroom. The bright, recessed lighting caught the edge of my diamond earrings. I stepped inside, letting the doors close with a heavy final click behind me. For 3 full seconds, the room was absolutely paralyzed. Valerie froze with her crystal champagne flute halfway to her mouth. Chloe dropped her smartphone directly onto the polished mahogany table with a loud clatter. Julian physically recoiled, his eyes widening in sheer, unadulterated panic, as if he had just seen a ghost. Preston was the only one who moved. He leaned forward, his flushed face contorting into a mask of aggressive, entitled confusion. They could not process what they were seeing. I was not wearing my modest cardigans or my sensible flats. I was wearing a bespoke charcoal gray designer suit tailored to weaponized perfection. I wore stilettos that made me stand taller than I ever had in their presence. But their arrogance was a terminal disease. Their brains simply could not compute that I belonged in this room. Preston slapped his heavy hand on the table. "What the hell is this?" he demanded, looking furiously from me to Julian. "Julian, did you tell her we were here? Are you completely out of your mind, bringing your domestic drama into a high-level corporate acquisition?" Julian scrambled to his feet. His face was flushed crimson with profound embarrassment. "I did not tell her anything, Preston, I swear." He turned to me, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and rage. "Camille, what is wrong with you? Are you stalking me? You need to leave right now. We are in the middle of a federal transaction. You are going to ruin everything." Valerie set her champagne glass down so hard the crystal nearly shattered against the wood. "This is a new low even for you, Camille." Valerie sneered, her voice dripping with absolute disgust. following us to a private corporate event just to throw a desperate tantrum because Julian finally cut you loose. Security. Valerie snapped her manicured fingers in the air, looking imperiously toward Attorney Caldwell and Jonathan at the end of the table. Gentlemen, I apologize for this deeply embarrassing intrusion. Please summon your building security immediately. This woman is unhinged, and we are expecting your primary investor at any moment. I did not stop walking. I moved with slow, deliberate precision toward the head of the table. Every click of my heels on the polished floor sounded like a gavel striking wood. I kept my eyes locked entirely on Julian. He shrank back into his leather chair, trying to make himself invisible, absolutely terrified that I was going to humiliate him in front of the wealthy men he was trying to impress. Preston stood up abruptly, stepping out from behind his chair to physically block my path to the head of the table. He puffed his chest out, towering over me, trying to use his sheer size and white male privilege to intimidate me back into submission. "Listen to me very carefully, little girl," Preston hissed, his voice dropping to a harsh, threatening whisper. "I do not care how you got past the lobby security, but you are going to turn around and walk out those doors before I have you arrested for corporate espionage. We are about to meet the billionaire owner of Apex Holdings. You are not going to ruin the biggest deal of my life." I stopped mere inches from Preston. I did not blink. I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact. I looked right through him, as if he were nothing more than a minor smudge on a piece of glass. Then I shifted my gaze past his shoulder to Attorney Caldwell. Caldwell stood up slowly, buttoning his tailored suit jacket with meticulous, chilling care. The room went dead silent again as the lead litigator prepared to speak. "Mr. Preston Caldwell," said his voice echoing with absolute freezing authority, "I strongly suggest you step away from my client and take your seat. Security will not be escorting anyone out of this building tonight except perhaps you." Preston frowned, his aggressive posture faltering just a fraction. The absolute certainty in Caldwell's voice had finally pierced through his thick layer of delusion. He looked at the attorney, then back at me, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. "Your client." Preston sputtered, letting out a nervous, disbelieving laugh. "What are you talking about? She is just a librarian. She is Julian's broke ex-wife." Jonathan stood up right next to Caldwell. He picked up the master acquisition file, a massive binder containing the financial lifeblood of everyone sitting at that table. He opened it slowly, looking directly at Valerie, who was now nervously clutching her diamond tennis necklace. "There seems to be a profound misunderstanding of the power dynamics in this room," Jonathan announced smoothly, his professional tone cutting through the heavy air like a scalpel. "Allow me to formally introduce the individual you have been waiting for all evening, Mr. Preston Julian, Mrs. Valerie. Please direct your attention to the head of the table." Jonathan gestured toward me with an open hand, a gesture of absolute, undeniable deference. "This is Camille Thomas," Jonathan stated clearly, ensuring every single syllable landed with maximum impact. "She is the sole heir to the Thomas Family Trust. She is the majority shareholder of Nexus Dynamics. And she is the absolute sole owner and chief executive officer of Apex Holdings." The immediate aftermath of those words was a masterpiece of human devastation. I stood at the head of the table and watched the oxygen completely leave the room. Valerie's mouth fell open in a silent, horrified gasp. The haughty, untouchable high society matriarch suddenly looked small, her face draining of all color until she was deathly pale. Her hands began to shake uncontrollably, rattling the heavy bracelets on her wrists. The woman who had told me I lacked pedigree was now staring at a woman who could buy and sell her entire social circle before breakfast. Chloe looked like she was going to be physically sick. She slumped back in her chair, her eyes darting frantically from my designer suit to the impassive faces of my corporate lawyers. The realization that she had openly mocked the clothing of a multimillionaire was crushing the breath right out of her lungs. Preston completely collapsed. The aggressive, towering venture capitalist backed away from me as if I were made of fire. He stumbled backward until the back of his knees hit his chair and he practically fell into his seat. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The fake tech incubator, the massive yacht lease, the desperate social climbing, it had all been financed by the very woman he had called a cute charity project. But Julian's reaction was the most exquisite. My husband looked as though he had been shot directly in the chest. He stared at me, his eyes wide and bloodshot, tracking the sleek lines of my suit, the confidence in my posture, and the cold, unfeeling look in my eyes. The arrogance he had worn at the country club brunch was completely obliterated. He realized in real time that the massive institutional backing he had been bragging about, the miraculous bailout that was supposed to make him a tech titan, was entirely orchestrated by the wife he had treated like garbage. He had drained our joint checking account to impress a man who was now legally my subordinate. He had forged my name on a mortgage to save a sinking ship that I now owned entirely. I stepped up to the head of the table. I placed my leather folder down on the polished mahogany surface. I looked at the four of them, letting the sheer terrifying reality of their situation settle over them. They were completely surrounded. They were entirely trapped in a corporate cage of my making, and there was absolutely nowhere left to run. I let the silence stretch for a long, agonizing minute. I watched the absolute terror sink into their bones. They were completely surrounded, entirely trapped in a corporate cage of my making, and there was absolutely nowhere left to run. Valerie was the first to find her voice. Her survival instinct, honed by decades of ruthless social climbing, kicked in. She swallowed hard, her throat visibly bobbing as she tried to force her face into a mask of maternal warmth. It was a grotesque, desperate performance. "Camille, darling," Valerie stammered, her voice shaking so badly she sounded out of breath. "This is simply astonishing. You kept this a secret from us. If we had known you had this kind of institutional backing, we never would have treated you with such hesitation. You must understand we were only trying to protect Julian. But this changes everything. We are family. We can build an empire together." I looked at her with pure, unfiltered disgust. "We are not family, Valerie. We never were. And I did not keep my father's legacy a secret because I was ashamed of it. I kept it a secret because General Thomas warned me about people exactly like you. He told me that true wealth attracts parasites who wear friendly faces. He left me a highly diversified blind trust worth exactly $58 million. He earned every single cent of it through discipline and honor, two concepts you could not comprehend if your life depended on it." At the sound of the number, Chloe let out a sharp, involuntary gasp. $58 million. It was more money than Preston's entire fraudulent venture capital firm had ever managed on its best day. Valerie's face contorted into a sickening mix of overwhelming greed and profound, inescapable horror. She was staring at a woman she had banished to a catering kitchen, realizing that woman could have funded her entire charity gala out of petty cash. Julian suddenly stood up. His chair scraped loudly against the floor. He ran a hand over his face, a manic, desperate smile breaking through his shock. The absolute cowardice of my husband was truly a marvel to witness. In a matter of seconds, his brain had bypassed the humiliation and latched directly onto the money. "Babe," Julian said, his voice thick with a sudden sickening affection. He actually took a step to me, holding his hands out as if he wanted to embrace me. "Babe, this is incredible. Why did you not tell me? Do you realize what this means for us with my tech division and your capital? We do not need Preston. We do not need outside investors. We are legally married. This is our money. We can take over the entire market." I was so blinded by his own entitlement that he actually believed his marriage certificate was a winning lottery ticket. He thought that because we lived in a state that recognized marital property, he had just stumbled backward into $29 million. I did not back away from him. I simply reached into my leather folder. I pulled out the thick 40-page legal document his mother had brought into my kitchen just days after our wedding. I slid the post-nuptial agreement across the polished mahogany table. It stopped directly in front of Julian's hands. Julian looked down at the document, his manic smile faltering. "I think you are forgetting the protocol, Julian," I said, my voice echoing coldly in the massive boardroom. "You and your mother were very insistent that we protect our individual assets. You wanted to make absolutely certain that my dead weight did not drag down your brilliant tech career." I turned my gaze to my lead litigator. "Attorney Caldwell, would you please remind my husband of the specific terms he and his mother forced me to sign?" Caldwell stood up, his face devoid of any mercy. "Certainly. Under the terms of the post-nuptial agreement drafted by your own family attorney, any undisclosed premarital assets, including trusts, inheritances, and capital holdings remain solely the absolute property of the original owner. The document explicitly shields these assets from the spouse and makes them completely immune to marital commingling in any state jurisdiction. Caldwell looked directly at Valerie, driving the final nail into her coffin. By forcing my client to sign that document, you legally locked your son out of $58 million. He is not entitled to a single dime. Valerie let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. She pressed her hands to her mouth, staring at the document on the table. The realization of what she had done crashed down on her with the force of a falling building. Her obsession with pedigree, her desperate need to control her son's finances, had completely destroyed his chance at generational wealth. She had handed me the ultimate legal shield. Julian stared at the post-nuptial agreement. His chest began to heave. He looked at his mother with an expression of pure, unadulterated hatred. The unified front of their toxic family was shattering right in front of my eyes. "You made me do this!" Julian hissed at Valerie, his voice trembling with rage. "You brought that lawyer to my house. You told me she was a gold digger. Do not blame your mother for your own cowardice, Julian." I cut in sharply, snapping his attention back to me. "You are a grown man. You chose to sit by and watch her humiliate me. You chose to drain our joint checking account to buy a fraction of a yacht you could not afford. And you chose to commit federal fraud to save a man who treats you like a dog." Preston, who had been sitting in stunned silence, suddenly bristled. "Watch your mouth, Camille. You might have money, but you do not understand corporate finance. You bought my debt fine, but I still run Vanguard Capital. You cannot just walk in here and insult me." I pulled a second stack of documents from my leather folder. I tossed them onto the table. They were the forensic financial audits Jonathan's team had compiled over the weekend. "You do not run anything, Preston," I said, my voice rising with absolute authority. "You are running a glorified Ponzi scheme. Your venture capital firm is hemorrhaging money. You have falsified your quarterly earnings reports to your private equity lenders for the last 2 years. That is corporate fraud. When Apex Holdings purchased your debt portfolio, we also acquired the right to audit your books. You are entirely insolvent." Preston's face went completely white. He reached for the audit reports with shaking hands, his arrogant posture completely obliterated. Chloe let out a quiet, terrified whimper, shrinking down in her chair as she realized her luxurious lifestyle was officially over. "And as for you, Julian," I continued, pulling the final, most damning piece of paper from my folder. I held up the second mortgage application. The bright blue ink of my forged signature caught the harsh lighting of the boardroom. "I found the loan agreement in your filing cabinet," I said, watching the last ounce of hope drain from my husband's eyes. $750,000 leveraged against our Maryland home. A home you legally encumbered by forging my signature on a federal banking document. You committed wire fraud and bank fraud to funnel money into Preston's failing company." Julian collapsed back into his leather chair. He put his head in his hands, his fingers gripping his hair as a low, pathetic groan escaped his lips. He knew exactly what this meant. He was not just facing bankruptcy, he was facing a mandatory federal prison sentence. The corporate attorneys and board members, sitting at the far end of the table, watched the scene in stunned, horrified silence. Valerie's entire elite facade had been ripped away, exposing a family of desperate, fraudulent criminals willing to steal from their own spouses to maintain an illusion of high society grandeur. They were stripped bare, completely humiliated in the very room where they had expected to be crowned royalty. I stood at the head of the table, looking down at the 4 people who had tried to break my spirit. I felt no pity. I felt no regret. I felt the profound, righteous satisfaction of a woman who had simply allowed her enemies to dig their own graves. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The silence in the boardroom was absolute and suffocating. Everyone was waiting for my final command. I turned my attention back to Jonathan, who sat with his hands neatly folded over the master acquisition file. "Jonathan," I said, keeping my tone strictly professional, "please inform Mr. Preston of his immediate future." Jonathan nodded. "As the sole creditor of Vanguard Capital, Apex Holdings is officially calling in all outstanding debts, effective immediately. Since your firm is entirely insolvent, We are seizing all assets and initiating a hostile liquidation. By tomorrow morning, your firm will officially cease to exist. Furthermore, we are obligated to turn over our complete forensic audit to the Securities and Exchange Commission. You will be facing a federal investigation for defrauding your private equity investors. Preston looked like he could not breathe. The loud, arrogant venture capitalist who had mocked my dress and belittled my career was completely gone. His face turned a sickly pale shade of gray. He grabbed the edge of the heavy mahogany table, gasping for air, as the reality of federal prison settled heavily onto his chest. He was going to lose his sprawling Potomac mansion. He was going to lose his imported sports cars. He was going to lose his freedom. Chloe let out a loud, pathetic wail. She grabbed Preston by the arm, her heavy diamond rings clicking frantically against his expensive suit sleeve. "What does he mean?" Preston Chloe sobbed, completely ignoring the professional setting and the staring executives. "What does he mean we are being liquidated? We have society galas to attend. We have a yacht lease to finalize." "You do not have a yacht, Chloe," I said softly. "You do not even have a personal bank account that is not currently frozen by my legal team, pending the fraud investigation. Your entire life was a performance funded by stolen money and fake prestige. The show is officially over." I turned my gaze to Julian. My husband was trembling violently in his leather chair. Sweat was visibly beading on his forehead and rolling down his neck, ruining the collar of his custom-tailored shirt. He had tied his entire identity to his title as a tech executive. He had forged my name to buy his way into a world he could not afford, and now the bill had come due. "And Julian," I continued, my voice perfectly steady and relentlessly clear, "as the majority shareholder of Nexus Dynamics, I have reviewed your employment contract. Given your recent engagement in wire fraud and bank fraud regarding the forged secondary mortgage on our property, you are in direct violation of the corporate ethics and criminal conduct clauses. You are terminated effective immediately. You have no severance package. Your unvested stock options are permanently revoked. You will pack your desk tomorrow morning under the strict supervision of my private security team." Julian fell to his knees. He actually slid out of his plush leather chair and dropped directly onto the carpeted floor of the corporate boardroom. The corporate attorneys and board members sitting at the end of the table watched in absolute unshielded disgust. Valerie covered her eyes with her hands, utterly mortified by her son's pathetic display of weakness in front of the very people she desperately wanted to impress. "Camille, please," Julian begged, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, desperate whine. "Please do not do this. I am your husband. I love you. We can fix this. I will do whatever you want. I will go to counseling. I will sell the house to pay the debt. Please do not take my job away. I have absolutely nothing else." I looked down at him. I remembered how he had looked at me when he casually drained our joint checking account. I remembered how he had smirked when his mother called me a temporary placeholder at the country club brunch. He did not love me. He loved the illusion of power. And now that I held all the real power, he was completely willing to beg at my feet like an obedient dog. I stepped away from Julian and looked directly at Valerie. She was staring wide-eyed at the other executives in the room. These were the wealthy, highly connected people she had invited to witness her family's glorious ascension into the billionaire class. Instead, they were witnessing a spectacular, deeply humiliating criminal collapse. The board members were actively whispering to each other, their faces filled with harsh judgment and open scorn. Valerie's precious social standing, the very thing she valued above basic human decency, was burning to ash right in front of her eyes. She would never be invited to another charity gala. She would never be able to show her face at the country club again without people whispering about her fraudulent, bankrupt family. She was a total social pariah in Washington, D.C. Valerie tried to sit up straight, desperately attempting to salvage some tiny shred of her dignity. "You are a monster, Camille." Valerie hissed, her voice shaking with impotent, terrified rage. "You set us up! You tricked my family!" "I did not trick you, Valerie," I replied calmly. "I simply allowed you to be exactly who you are. You demanded a post-nuptial agreement because you thought I was poor and beneath you. You pushed Julian to steal because you demanded an extravagant lifestyle you could not afford. I did not force you to be greedy. I just bought the consequences of your greed." I reached into my leather folder one last time. I pulled out a thin stack of papers bound by a single gold clip. I dropped them onto the mahogany table right next to the post-nuptial agreement she had shoved in my face. "These are the divorce papers," I announced. "I have already signed them. My legal team will handle the court filings. You can keep the Maryland house, Julian, seeing as you illegally mortgaged it for $750,000. I hope you enjoy paying that back to my holding company with no job and no assets." Julian stayed on the floor, sobbing quietly into his hands. Chloe was weeping openly, ruining her expensive makeup. Preston was staring blindly at the wall in a state of catatonic shock. Valerie sat frozen in her chair, her fake empire reduced to absolutely nothing. I did not gloat. I did not scream. I did not feel the need to explain my victory or demand a tearful apology. My father had taught me that the most devastating weapon you can use against a narcissist is absolute chilling indifference. They were not worth my anger. They were simply a bad investment that I had successfully liquidated. I turned to attorney Caldwell and Jonathan. "Gentlemen, please finalize the corporate transition and the police reports. I am going home." Caldwell bowed his head respectfully. "Have a very good evening, Ms. Thomas." I turned my back on my former family. I walked toward the heavy mahogany doors. The click of my stilettos echoed loudly in the silent room. I did not look back to see their faces. I pushed the doors open and stepped out into the quiet carpeted hallway. I took the private elevator down to the grand lobby. When the doors parted, I walked out into the warm, humid air of the Washington, D.C. evening. The city was bustling with vibrant life. Politicians, executives, and ordinary people were walking down the sidewalks completely unaware of the financial execution that had just taken place 20 stories above them. A sleek black town car was waiting for me at the curb. The driver promptly opened the rear door. I slid into the soft leather seat, placing my empty tote bag next to me. The engine purred to life, and the car pulled smoothly away from the curb, merging into the glowing stream of city traffic. I looked out the tinted window at the passing monuments and the bright city lights. I thought about the library basement where I loved to work. I thought about the rare historical documents waiting to be preserved. I had protected my peace. I had honored my father's legacy. I had walked into a trap designed to destroy my future, and I had dismantled it with surgical precision. I leaned my head back against the plush leather headrest. I took a deep, cleansing breath. I was entirely free. I was immensely powerful. And for the first time since the day I got married, I was completely at peace. The ultimate lesson from this story is that true power never needs to scream for attention. When toxic family members or a manipulative partner constantly underestimate your worth, your greatest weapon is absolute silence. You do not need to argue your value to people who are entirely committed to misunderstanding you. Instead, you secure your foundation, protect your peace, and move with strategic precision. Greed and arrogance are blinding. When you allow narcissistic individuals to believe they hold all the cards, they will inevitably overplay their hand and architect their own spectacular downfall. Setting ironclad boundaries and maintaining financial independence is not just about survival. It is about reclaiming total control over your life's narrative. Never shrink yourself to accommodate someone else's fragile ego, and never hesitate to let people face the brutal consequences of their own malicious choices. Real freedom is looking at the people who tried to break you with chilling indifference and walking away entirely on your own terms. Have you ever had to silently outsmart toxic relatives who thought they could control your future? Share your triumphant story in the comments below and hit that subscribe button for more empowering tales of ultimate vindication.